Ben Shapiro, Joe Berry, and Jordan Peterson claimed that Western civilization came from the Middle East. They claimed that we in Europe were barbarians until the Ten Commandments came along and civilized us. Their formula for this assertion is to say that Western civilization is based on Judeo-Christian values, and without that we would have nothing.
Judeo-Christian values are predicated on the existence of a God of morality. The entire Western world, what we call Western civilization, is based on this understanding.
The values that resonate most with human beings are eternal, not changeable, and not relativistic. They are universal, they are not group specific. And most of all, they apply to individual human beings, not group labels. And those values were first embedded clearly and concisely in the Ten Commandments.
Of course, this is a beautiful idea, eternal values that are not group specific. But of course, these values only came from one place. And these influencers are wont to remind us of that at every opportunity. Despite us Westerners being the vessel that brings these Judeo-Christian values to the entire world and saves everyone on the planet, we are not the source. We must learn to humble ourselves. Joe Berry, the editor at Babylon Bee, put it this way. Western civilization, says Joe, began on Mount Sinai. This is, of course, the moment during Exodus where Moses had the Ten Commandments revealed to him by the one true God, which he then brought to the world in order to teach the one true religion. And until that prophecy reached us, we Europeans, we Westerners, we were barbarians. We were living in mud huts. We were amoral, master moralists, engaging in horrible acts, human sacrifice, living in darkness, full of hate in our hearts, hating the truth, hating civility itself. We were only saved when Judeo-Christian culture made its way into our bosom. Well, what if I was to tell you that Joel Berry's belief that Western civilization began on Mount Sinai is not only wrong on its face, but wrong on a deeper level? What if Judeo-Christian civilization did not even begin on Mount Sinai? You see, over the last 100 years, there has been ample opportunity for many different scholars to go into Sinai and Egypt and Israel and try to excavate these regions to discover hard proof that something like Exodus and Moses actually happened. Now, many of these researchers were hardcore American evangelicals. Many of them are Israeli. They both really want to find hard proof because their identity depends upon this. But despite this, their searches have come up barren. The scholarly consensus that has emerged based on the evidence that they find in archaeological research is that Exodus, Moses, and the beginning of the Old Testament, which is Deuteronomy, simply did not happen the way it is told in the Bible. It looks like Moses and the revelations of the Ten Commandments given to the chosen people were fabrications, myths deployed by later political regimes in order to establish legitimacy. But it gets much worse, because if you pull out this foundation stone, it brings a lot of things into question. And more recent archaeologists have begun to think about this problem. How do we confirm exactly when all of this Judeo-Christian culture really began? Now, one of these archaeologists, Jonathan Adler, in the last couple of years decided that what he was going to do is find proof of when Judaism was being practiced in archaeology, when pig bones vanish, when certain temple rituals are happening. And then he would work backwards from that point until all of that stuff stops, showing that Judaism is not being practiced anymore. So he began during the Roman times, when we know for certain that Judaism was real. And he went backwards and discovered that it only extends back 200 years. Now, this is a big problem, because the one true Torah religion that was revealed in the Old Testament and followed by the Israelites, this was supposed to be over 1,000 years older than that. And instead, it's only showing up after Alexander the Great had taken over half the world and Greek culture had spread all across the horizon. This is happening as Rome are rising to their ascendancy. This is very, very recent. And we'll get into more conspiratorial takes by people who claim that this Torah religion, the Judeo-Christian values that are the foundation of Western culture, may have actually been formed in the bosom of the Greek Empire of Alexander, where all these Judeo-Christians were in the grand library of Alexandria, reading Babylonian myths and Platonism and Greek stories, and structuring their new national project, creating a noble lie, a magical mythos, in order to legitimize and support this. Which may mean that Joel Berry is upside down. Western civilization did not begin in Mount Sinai. Judeo-Christian civilization did not begin in Mount Sinai. Judeo-Christian civilization began within the bosom of Western civilization. And all of this hinges on a very important moment in history, which is the Athenian Golden Age, the birth of philosophy, Socrates and Plato. You see, after the Spartan 300 fight against Xerxes and Persia, and then the Athenians finally beat him, they have this moment of wonder and victory. Out of this comes natural philosophy, the beginnings of science, democracy, theater, this revolution in the arts and culture, this arrival of all those beautiful statues for the first time. And this sets a new cultural paradigm never before seen on earth by mankind. Nietzsche calls this the first event in culture. Here Plato mentions establishing a republic with high priests and mythologizing a people's past and creating this formula of 12 tribes to structure this republic. And of course, even presents in Timaeus, a very popular work at that time, the idea that there is a monotheistic one God creator of reality, the architect of this world. And the way this conspiracy goes is that centuries after this golden age, the Judeans have an opportunity to read all this and they think, this is full of brilliant ideas. Let's implement it. Let's do this. Let's take our vague, pagan national myths and morph them into something more compelling. Now, I don't expect you to take any of this on face value. What we will do in this video is go through this comprehensively. I will show you all the evidence. I will point you to the scholars so you can check it all out yourself, because this argument is actually very evidence-based. There is a lot of compelling reasons to follow this. What I'm going to do is show you a variety of different perspectives so you can really stew in the information. But for the sake of transparency, I should reveal my bias. Always keep this in mind. My main concern here is that this negation of the Western soul by these claims of Judeo-Christianity, of us Europeans not being allowed to have pride or even understanding ourselves as being a source of profound culture and civilization, leads to this guilt, this self-hate that is so common, which you see across the West. It's one of the foundations of woke, despite these anti-woke champions claiming this type of thinking. And one of the best ways you can see this is in the European Jordan Peterson. His thinking negates and demoralizes the Western soul because our culture really only came from the Middle East. We're just holding up impossible propositions and passing them on to the world. We don't have an agency, a creative source, a prophetic soul. That all came from Mount Sinai.
And you're using your great fortune at being a beneficiary of that system. Look at what we've got here, this great peace that we're inhabiting right now. You're using your unearned, the unearned gift that's been granted to you as a source of personal pride in your accomplishments due to your skin. It's like, no, not good, not a good argument. So, and that doesn't mean that, well, there's nothing valuable about European culture. There's plenty about it that's valuable. It's not even so clear to what degree it's European. I mean, it came out of the Middle East, you know. I mean, it's so muddle-headed that you hardly know where to start.
Muddle-headed is quite the apt term, and there's a lot of that going on here. So let me bring some clarity. Because Jordan Peterson has invested a lot in these impossible propositions, but it seems like they're making him sick. And this seems to define his life, the sickly, weeping philosopher. And this might not have to be the case. Maybe he doesn't have to negate himself so ferociously. Maybe the truth is actually on our sides. The problem is that if you really want the truth, it might destroy absolutely everything that you treasure, even your sacred illusions. So let us get into it. I hope you enjoy. This is quite an odyssey. I would buckle up. I bring in a lot of crazy things here. Archaeology, neuroscience. I'm really digging deep because this topic fascinates me. I highly enjoyed researching and making this video. I hope you enjoy it half as much. Let's do it. So let us sink our teeth into Exodus and how can we prove the historical reality of this part of the Bible? Because it is foundational to the entire mythos of Judeo-Christianity and the promise of the one true religion coming out of Judea. It has to be true for all of that to hold together, or else you're on very shaky foundations for pretty much every claim that comes afterwards. Ben Shapiro and Joel Berry are telling us that Western civilization starts at this moment. Well, did this moment happen? How do we verify it? This is the moment where Moses is in Egypt and he goes on an exodus. He takes a group of Israelites who are enslaved by the evil Pharaoh and he moves them through the desert of Sinai, upon which he gets the revelation with the 10 Commandments, brings it down to the Israelites and says, we're going to follow this religion now, put down the golden calf, get rid of all this nonsense. And then they go into the promised land and they wage a conquest with Joshua where they take the promised land for themselves. This establishes Israel as the root, and they set up the first temple and worship God in their little colony. The impossible propositions, which are a gift to all people, are revealed to the chosen treasured people and then established in this world with a state and a temple. Well, this is where we introduce our scholars. We're going to go through a lot of different scholars today that take many different positions. For Exodus, we're going to deal with people who are moderate or maximalist. They believe most of the Bible, or at least some of it. The crazier ideas about the Greek origin of the Bible, this would be the minimalists. We will deal with this later. Now, I don't think any of these scholars would enjoy being called any of these labels. Nobody likes being a label, but this is just a general set of categories for us plebs to understand this very complicated intellectual bickering. So we have Russell Gmerkin and Jotan Adler. They will come later. They are the very fancy stuff. They're the wild stuff. The stuff that really gets your noggin clocking. But now we're going to deal with William Dever, Israel Finkelstein, who are more moderate, and Kenneth Kitchen, who believes that the Bible is pretty much entirely literal. Now, what you notice when we dive into this is that this knowledge is tied to people's most intimate identity, people's relationship with truth and God and death, and people's relationship with purpose and meaning, and also integration within a community. If you go into your evangelical church and you'll be like, wow, I just figured out the Bible's wrong. You're not going to be able to get a girlfriend and get married. You're going to get ostracized and people are going to treat you weird. The incentive for you is to lie. If you're Jordan Peterson, you've built your entire career on promoting a Bible. Are you going to show up next week and be like, actually, I have some doubts about this? Your mind will not permit you to perceive the truth if it threatens the way you operate your life. We'll get into the neuroscience of this later in more depth, but this is foundational. The part of your mind that seems to connect to collective and religious identity, the posterior medial frontal cortex, is also the part of your mind that progenerates cognitive dissonance. And that's a big problem. Because truth and life are at war in your own head, and it's all tied to God and community. That's a big issue. William Dever and Kenneth Kitchen, these men who are more convinced that the Bible's generally true, they are both from evangelical Christian backgrounds or heavily Christian backgrounds. And watching how they deal with the knowledge tells an awful lot. William Dever basically followed the archaeology and over time describes this painful experience of his identity getting destroyed and him abandoning the faith. He began to say, well, there's no persuasive way to say that Exodus happened. It did not happen. It's not true. And he couldn't reconcile this with the beliefs of the evangelical community. So he converted to Judaism. And then when he was in Judaism, he was doing this because at least it gave him some sort of identity or connection, and then he said, no, this sucks, I don't like this either, so he became a secular atheist. Now, while he was doing that, the evangelicals all called him a lost soul. He abandoned evangelical, various things like this. And Kenneth Kitchen, who was quite popular among the evangelicals, he basically runs with the idea that the evidence has not disproven enough yet. So I'm going to take the biblical narratives on faith until we have negating evidence, absolute evidence that says, no, this definitely did not happen. So Dever will accuse Kitchen of not embracing objective truth, refusing to look at the evidence with clear eyes and standing in his own bias. And Kenneth Kitchen will accuse Dever of being a nihilistic atheist who is reducing everything down to pure archaeological evidence and not allowing the romance of the story to seduce you. Now, it's important to understand this because this bias exists in you. How can we even approach the truth if we don't look at our souls, our psychology, our neuroscience, to understand how much that gets in the way of our ability to even interface with the truth and evidence? Perhaps me, the presenter here, maybe I'm too biased towards Dever's archaeology focus, and I'll explain why in a moment. Maybe I'm not allowing myself to get seduced by the majesty of the story. Or maybe the majesty of the story is a perfect tool of seduction that blinds you, switches on your cognitive dissonance, and stops you seeing reality. And I know many of you out there will chimp because of this. Maybe you're Jewish. Maybe you're a Christian who recently converted. And you will say to yourself, all right, well, I don't want this to be true. I don't want the negation of Exodus to happen. So you will twist and distort. You will refuse to look with clear eyes. And that is a big problem. You should try catch yourself doing this. Can you inspect your soul in this way? And maybe there will be atheists, pagans who are like, well, let's shut out. Let's get those Jews. Let's get those Christians. Let's shove it in their face that this is wrong. And that could cloud our judgment as well. We extrapolate too much out of too little evidence. We must always be on guard for this. And this is a very difficult thing to be on guard for. It's so intimately wrapped up with cognitive dissonance and our identities that it's almost impossible to pursue the truth. And you might say, Steph, why are you chudding out about truth so much? Get to the information. But I'm trying to tell the story right, because this is actually an incredible quest for the truth. What has the Bible been to us for the last 2,000 years? It has proposed itself as the truth in and of itself. And we've taken it for granted that that is what it was. And even people like Nietzsche would say that this had actually a profound disciplining effect upon the European mind. We read the good book, think of it as the truth, and we learn to inspect this truth, which creates focus inside of us, scribal intensity, which evolves into this unified science of Europe. But for 2,000 years, our approach to this truth has been very limited to the scriptures, to the word, to the realm of the spirit, which is very much what defined this religious age. This obsession with words and concepts and ideas. And if you doubted these ideas, you were told, first of all, theologically, that you're going against faith. And number two, politically, they would probably burn you at the stake. They would not take dissent lightly. But during the Enlightenment, we began to wrestle off this narrow thinking, and we opened up other perspectives to truth. We began reading Greek authors and historical authors and cross-examining the claims in the Bible. And this burst open the perspective taking that led to the first doubts in biblical accuracy. We have people like Ernst Renan in the 19th century who goes on to say that, okay, listen, after cross-examining a lot of different stuff, I don't think Jesus was God. I think he was a man who was very much present in a political situation and time, and he psychologizes Jesus. Nietzsche, for example, read Renan and extended this psychological thinking. But we're still trapped in the realm of words and your psychological take, your hot take, and what you think is going on inside people's heads. And this can be precise and accurate and intuitive, but it is limited. It is very prone to bias. You're going off hearsay. Is there better evidence that we can ascertain? And of course, in the 20th century, we got it. The arrival of archaeology. This is materialism. We came out of the world of the spirit and we went down into the quiet world of matter, which seemed to contain no information to our ancestors who would just look at it and, maybe say, well, what can we really know about this? To the arrival of our penetrating specific science that can extract incredible amounts of information from very, very little things, like looking at a log, carbon dating it, and then being able to get a vaguely precise date. Been able to find artifacts, gather them all, and be very precise and construct a picture. Having the sophisticated societies capable of maintaining this, supporting archaeologists. This is a huge step forward, which allows us to vastly contend with the knowledge within the books. And archaeology gives us completely different forms of knowledge, because archaeology can't lie to us. Words can lie. Mud can't. Or maybe it just doesn't want to. Pottery, burns, that will tell us the reality. And we can use precision to map things out much, much better. So archaeology can also call out the truth, call out the spirit, the words, the books. And deeper still, as we've gotten more into the 21st century, we've gone through the human genome revolution. Thank you, Barack Obama, for pioneering this. And this has allowed us to look into our cells and discover information hidden in our flesh. Do you think our ancients understood that there was like magic code inside our muscles? Well, all flesh contains this, and if we find bodies, which we found loads from these areas back in the dating of the biblical stories, we will be able to unearth information about the people themselves, their DNA, and we can construct stories out of this. Matter is revealing to us information that the Spirit could never tell us, and this allows us to challenge the Spirit heavily. Now, what I would like to contribute in this is some neuroscientific principles, because we see the likes of Nietzsche, Renan, they speculate psychological ideas and intuitively are accurate, as I said. But I even like neuroscience because this is almost like a deeper, mechanistic way of understanding our psychology. It grounds it in substructures in our brains. So it should be precise. And if neuroscience is in any way useful, it should be able to explain or at least show us some of these mechanisms that might be going on. And this is what we'll get into. The neuroscience of God, perhaps, is coming up soon. So now you see why we are gaining a higher resolution picture as we go further into the 20th and 21st century. We are unlocking different modes of knowledge that are enhancing the amount of perspectives that we have, which inevitably lead to us having higher resolution pictures. And this is why we're turning to archaeologists, because there's a lot of people out there who believe based on historicism, reading books, reading history and putting it all together, but your cognitive dissonance is going to bend history to flatter your own soul. Things like archaeology is obnoxious. It shoves stuff in your face that you don't want to hear. Materialism is brute, but it is foundational and true. It is our European natural science that is giving us this ability for better penetrating depth. And the genetics are only brand new. And a lot of this is cutting edge. So this is why we're turning to the archaeologists to see what they say. How can their materialistic work fact check what we're being told about the Bible? What does it reveal? So the archaeologists claim that there's 3 parts of the Exodus narrative that we should be able to reliably test in order to confirm if it happened or not. The first would be the journey out of Egypt through Sinai in the desert. The second would be the arrival of these Israelites and their conquest of the promised land, which would show cities burnt to the ground as they took over. And the last would be the evidence of a shift in the population as this new set of Israelites showed up and took over. And the star of this section of the show are the ancient Egyptians, because the ancient Egyptians were a military state. And like all big chimps, their concern is monitoring their territory and making sure that no other little groups are going to rise up and try to fight them. So they constantly scan all across their reality to try and find people. They make mention of people. Now from this we gain one mention of what looks to be the Israelites in the Levant about 1,000 years before Christ. This still suggests that there was an Israelite people in this area, but they weren't a state, but they were a tribe. Now the next very good piece of evidence is that there is a group of people from the Levant, from the Promised Land, modern-day Israel, that go from there over into Egypt. And these people are named the Hyksos. These guys took over the city of Avaris and ruled from there. They brought in chariots and bronze weapons, and the Egyptians had to run up and kick them out after a while. Now these Hyksos, these lads are a great candidate to be the main character. They have great main character energy. They have great riz. They have great aura. We have images of them, and they all have mushroom haircuts. They're like Looney Tunes Zoomers. They're absolute mad lads, coming in here looksmacks with these very manicured haircuts on with bronze weapons and chariots, dominating these Egyptians, bringing the true religion. putting down these, heathens that are all around them and establishing their fortress in the north and conquering from there. Now, throughout history, people have said that these Hyksos were obviously the Israelites. These were the people that went into Egypt. This is great, but there's a lot of problems. One, these people were conquerors, bringing in new technology and overcoming Egypt. They were not slaves who were subjugated. And this is where Deuteronomy begins to betray itself a bit, because what the story in the Bible says is that Moses is living under Pharaoh Ramses. And Ramses, we know, was in the 13th century BC, meaning that we're a couple of centuries away from when the Hyksos even left. Now, maybe Moses and all these guys are leftovers, but now what we're seeing is the chronology is all breaking down. We're having serious issues here. Now, more maximalists like Kenneth Kitchen grab onto this, but specifically lean heavy on the stories. They're very historically based. And we do know that the Egyptians at this point said, oh yeah, we had slaves working on building various cities around Egypt at this time, like Ramses cities, which is mentioned in the Bible. And so this all nicely fits. But if we're trying to put this together with what archaeology we have, like for example the Hyksos, it just doesn't really connect. So there's a lot of sloppiness going on here. That's a bit of a frustration. And this is what leads us to the big tension point, the big question. All right, do we have proof of an exodus out of Egypt through Sinai? Because that is what would tell us that this story is real. Is there any archaeological proof? And there should be. Because the claim in the Bible is 600,000 to 2 million people moved through this desert. And if that was the case, they would leave stuff behind. There are these tribes called the Bedouin tribes in Sinai that leave artifacts, and they're tiny. Now, if there was this many people, an entire nation, and then they went and conquered this promised land, it would show. There would be stuff littered everywhere. These Hyksos, we have loads of artifacts from them. And they don't worship Yahweh, they worship Baal, they eat pork. And this is really what rocked William Dever's mind. Because he said, right, I'm going to do excavations in Sinai. I'm going to go there, I'm going to map it out, and we're going to find places where we would find Moses. And look, and we're going to search as deeply as we can. And this place has been studied a lot, and they just cannot find anything. There is no evidence of a movement through Sinai. The enormity of the movement doesn't leave any evidence. Even if you reduce the size of the population to something more modest, they still don't have any evidence. We're running off the idea that Sinai could have happened, and just because we can't find something doesn't mean it's not true. And this is actually the line that Kenneth Kitchen takes, the more literist one. He says, all right, look, absence of evidence, we can deal with that. I'm going to rely on the history until proven otherwise. This is absence of evidence. This is nothing important. But William Dever points out that this negation is enormous because it cuts the root of the most important story in history. If there was no Sinai, there was no Moses, no revelation of the Ten Commandments, no covenant to the promised chosen people. And therefore, how can these religions even stand? And this is what Black Pill Dever went there and looked. He searched. He dug stuff up. He came out empty-handed. Now, this narrow point of evidence is quite damning, but it doesn't make much sense until you put it together with the whole picture. When you look at the problems with the Joshua conquest and, of course, the genetics we have on the Israelite people themselves. This is where you really begin to fill in the perspective that takes the scholarly position that is considered consensus. There was no Exodus. There was no Moses. The people of Israel emerged out of the Levant, out of local tribes following a pagan religion, and they did not come in as conquerors. There was no Joshua conquest, and there was no Exodus traveling out of Egypt. This is not what happened.
But I think the majority of the ancestors of ancient Israel and Judah had never been in Egypt. They were essentially Canaanites, displaced both geographically and ideologically. The point is, if there was no conquest by an Exodus group, there was no Exodus group. And if there was no Exodus group, there was no Exodus.
Now, the Hyksos anomaly, where you have a Semitic people conquering a part of Egypt, Dever and many other writers basically say that this was obviously a true event, but what happened much later in history is the scribes of Judea would look back at their people and their pagan myths, which would vaguely remember this conquest. We once went in and took a portion of Egypt, and then we returned perhaps, and they might say to themselves, all right, well, let's spin this into a practical foundation myth. And they turn this into Deuteronomy. So there's not reality to Deuteronomy of a large nation moving across the desert. It's a misremembering, a bending, a using of ancient memory and transforming it into something new. Meaning that Moses, Deuteronomy, the chosen people, the Ten Commandments may have been constructed later for political reasons. And this is what leads us into Israel Finkelstein, who is much more comfortable embracing this idea that scribes would bend and use history in order to suit themselves in political situations. He is a bit more controversial than Dever, and they often argue against each other. But Finkelstein is also an archaeologist who's done many digs himself and has discovered some key evidence. And he will help us clear up the other part of the Exodus story, where there was a conquest by Joshua which apparently brings in the people of Israel. Now, Israel Finkelstein did a lot of archaeological work in the hills around Jerusalem to try figure out when exactly these Israelites come in or arrive, and instead he figured out that they emerge out of these hills. They're farmers, pastoralists with sheep, with goats, and they're following their pagan religion, and they kind of just gradually evolve into more sophisticated states. There's no massive inflow of an invading Israeli force. Instead, the people of Israel are the people of Canaan. They're not oppositional forces. There's no replacement. There's no conquest. None of that happens. And he made this prediction. He got a bit of heat for this, but genetics came in and actually confirmed what he said in 2020. We have 73 bodies from this area, which appear over the course of the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, so a large span of time. And scientists genetically tested these bodies to see, was there a massive change? Was there an arrival of 2 million people that changed the genome, which is exactly what you would expect? And instead, none of that happens. You just see this smooth, consistent transition, and everybody in Canaan remaining remarkably similar to each other all throughout a 1,000-year period when Exodus and Joshua's conquest apparently happens. Israel Finkelstein was vindicated. This is brutal, and it cuts the legs out from beneath the Joshua conquest. And this is something that people resisted because initially there were archaeological discoveries that seemed to confirm the Joshua. When the Zionists initially seized Israel in the 1940s, they began to do some archaeological digs because they wanted to discover what was the truth. And they actually found one of the cities mentioned in Joshua's conquest, Hazor, and they discovered that it had been eviscerated in flames. It had been burned to pieces at some point, destroyed, which is exactly what Joshua did in the Bible. And this was great. This showed proof of concept. The history is real. We were conquerors before, and we're back. But over time, as they excavated the other cities mentioned, because remember, there's a lot of cities that get torched by Joshua, they discovered that it probably didn't happen. In fact, a lot of these cities, sometimes they don't exist, they're unoccupied, or they're untouched during this period. And this becomes a major issue. The most famous, of course, is Jericho. They discovered that Jericho is just not really, there was no conquest there at all. It might not even have had the walls that apparently were pulled down by Joshua. And actually, of something like 14, 15 sites that apparently Joshua conquered, only 2 of them showed any evidence of a destruction, which further makes us think, why should we assume that it was the Israelites who did this? There was also a large invasion taking place at this time from, for example, the Sea People. This happened the same time, apparently, these Israelites come in. So why are we assuming that it was the Israelites when it doesn't match the story? So as archaeology has rolled forward in the 20th century, even up to the gene studies we're seeing in our time, there has been actually a breakdown of this myth. People have become less convinced as time has gone forward, and people like Israel Finkelstein put their neck out and be like, yeah, I don't think it happened quite that way, and they get heat. In fact, William Dever once called Finkelstein a post Zionist, which is quite fascinating because what is Finkelstein doing? He is an Israeli Jew. He works out of Tel Aviv and he's subverting the mythos of the conquering Zionist promised land. Now, Finkelstein is quite interesting because he is trying to present himself as a secular Enlightenment atheist, a proper European scientist. And maybe personally he has his beliefs about God, but he's trying to do the science the correct way, to follow the evidence to the letter. And people give him heat for this. They say he's a bad Jew. He's not protecting the aura of the Zionist project. And he's getting grilled by an evangelical American for this. And this is how serious this topic is. The truth causes pain. It hurts. It hits on tender points. It creates identity crises. It is related to our spirituality. In fact, it's the foundation of our belief in God and the future and our hope for the world. And if you take that away from people, it causes problems. The Zionist political project from Finkelstein's own people hinges on this idea that this is their promised land. And to pull that away, to use archaeology to undermine this is very dangerous, especially now that they're in a war. And so we have this crisis of conscience where we want to tell the truth, perhaps, be a good scientist, but that might involve us going against identity, going against political pragmatism, going against the needs of life itself.
So this is not history in the simple sense. And the case of Jericho applies also for other places mentioned in the tradition of the conquest in the book of Joshua. Many of the cities mentioned were not inhabited at all in the late Bronze Age. There was nothing there.
So in summary, we've always had to take writings and words on face value because we've had no other good avenues for knowledge. As we've fallen into the materialist age, we've opened up archaeology, and as that has progressed, we've gained genetics in recent years. This has given us a much broader perspective and has allowed us to contrast and fact-check the stories. And most of the moderate archaeologists say to us that the foundation of the Exodus myth, which is the foundation of the biblical idea of God giving a true religion to Moses, doesn't seem to hold much water. There was no conquest of the promised land by Joshua. There was no wandering through the desert in Sinai. There were interesting anomalies like a Hyksos group, which probably is loosely the basis of these stories. And the Israelites, the Jews, do come out of the promised land, out of Canaan. They emerge out of it, not as conquerors, but out of local tribes. Now, the next part of our investigation involves taking a look at God himself. The God of the Bible is the one true God. That is his claim. He reveals himself to Moses and he chooses the Israelites because he wants them to have the promised land so they can be the recipients of his religion, his one true religion for the world, because he created this world. William Dever and Israel Finkelstein unite on this topic as well, because the archaeology would tell us if these ancient Israelites were worshipping a monotheistic religion, which was unique, but that's not what we see. You would expect to find the temple and no evidence of, pagan worship. Instead, you look at the archaeological record and you discover there's shrines all over this place. You notice that there's an L from the ancient Canaanite people that eventually evolves into Yahweh, which then transforms thereafter. This Yahweh is not worshipped as a monotheist. He is treated as a pagan pantheon god. He has a wife, all these types of things. We don't see the evidence of any contraction into monotheism till at least the Iron Age, till at least 700 BC, which is very, very recent, and this is something Mr. Finkelstein speaks about a lot. Now, this is not a surprise, because if we run with the idea that there was no Exodus, there was no revelation in Sinai that brought in the true religion and set up a temple, we would not expect to see the arrival of a new people, which doesn't happen, who bring in this new religion and destroy all the idols around the Canaan place at the time. Instead, we would expect to see a natural evolution out of the local people, which is what the archaeology is telling us, where we have these Canaanite tribes who live in the highlands around Jerusalem and follow typical paganism, and then this gradually evolves into more sophisticated states in the Iron Age with King David and King Solomon, and they worship a more advanced version of this. It's just not the total monotheistic one true religion that we're told, but it is a normal, natural, healthy religion that we expect from these people. Now, this controversial idea is something that the minimalists bring up, specifically Jonathan Adler. He is saying that there is a stark difference between the ancient pagan religion of Yahwehism and the modern monotheistic religion we know as Judaism. And if we wanted to discover when Yahwehism transformed into Judaism, we should be able to discover that in the archaeology. We should be able to go back and find in the ground, in matter, proof of a people not eating pork, of following certain temple practices, of doing things a specific way. So he begins an archaeological investigation, and he's only done this in the 2020s, where he's searching for hard evidence of hard monotheistic Judaism as we understand it today. And he lives in Israel, so he can do it quite well. He can go to all the universities and check it all out. And he does this exploration, and he finds that there is a Judaism in the time of Rome. The way he justifies this is you can't find pork bones. These guys obviously don't like pigs and various things like this. And this continues into 100 BC, into 200 BC, but then suddenly it vanishes. All of a sudden pork bones appear. The way that the religion is worshipped changes. And it seems like it's transitioned back to Yahwehism. And this goes all the way back into prehistory. So his idea, his mental model, is that Yahwehism, this pagan god religion of a national project, is worshipped right up until Alexander the Great's time. And it was innovated and transformed into Judaism afterwards. Now, Adler presents hard archaeological evidence, and he's very evidence-based, and this causes a lot of issues, because this means that this idea of monotheism may have been innovated in this period, and then was rewritten back into the history of Israel. So we have a people coming out of the Levant who are essentially pagans, and they follow this Yahweh religion, and then there comes a point in their history later, very recently actually, where they need to bend or reshape or reforge their religion, and they choose to make it monotheist, and they rewrite their story, adding in Moses and Exodus, taking their old myths like the Hyksos and remembering them to make them suit their needs of the time, to create a new religion, which we understand as the truth. So this idea is that Yahweh went through an evolution. He started as a hardcore pagan like Wodan or Jupiter with his chosen people. And over time he evolved into a monotheist, the only God. But before he was embedded within a pantheon, which is the natural way to conduct yourself. Now, people have said this all throughout history. They say there is a stark divide between the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. The Old Testament God is very nasty. He's pagan. He's ruthless. He's commanding his chosen people to murder everybody in Jericho. People like Richard Dawkins, the atheist, looks at this and says, well, this God can't be real. He's too mean. He's too horrible. I can't believe that this is a moral God because he's a monster. And then the New Testament God weirdly aligns with these atheist values of being nice to everyone, being universal, believing in these grand, lofty moral ideas. And one of the best commentators on this phenomenon of the evolution of Yahweh is Friedrich Nietzsche, because he points out that the Old Testament God is based, that Richard Dawkins is a dork, he's a loser. Old Testament God is cool, he's pagan, he's like Wodan, he's going around and he's giving wedgies to all these people in Jericho. He is a master moralist. He cares about the power of the people of Yahweh. And what happens is the Jews get enslaved. They get enslaved over time and they find themselves subjects of the Assyrians, of the Babylonians, of the Greeks and of the Romans. And so they can no longer express this pagan power because they don't have any. So instead they transform their God into a nice God, a universal God, who doesn't like big, mean, strong, imperial people like Greeks. Instead, he favors the little people. He loves Frodo and Sam, the hobbits. And some of Nietzsche's best comments on this God phenomenon come from the Antichrist, where he's discussing the original religion of Israel that you find in the Bible. Originally, says Nietzsche, And above all, in the time of the monarchy, Israel maintained the right attitude of things, which is to say, the natural attitude. Israel's Yahweh was an expression of its consciousness of power, its joy in itself, its hopes for itself. Through him, the Jews looked for victory and salvation, and through him they expected nature to give them whatever was necessary to their existence, above all, rain. Yahweh is the God of Israel, and consequently the God of justice. This is the logic of every race that has power in its hands and a good conscience in the use of it. Now, what Nietzsche is saying here is critical for us to conduct our investigation properly, because there's an assumption that a universal God of truth, shared among all the people, is the right way to have a God, like Richard Dawkins would say. Morality must be for everybody. But the truth, the reality, is that if you go back in time and look at the natural emergent way that religion appears, he is always pagan. It is always nationalist, including this religion that is the foundation of most religions in the world. The universal religion of truth, the universal religion for all people, the monotheist religion, emerged out of this natural form. Now, because of this, we now condemn the morality of this old God, this Old Testament Yahweh, who is a pagan nationalist, who has his chosen people that he cares about, and mandates savagery and brutality in the name of their increasing power. We consider this a sin. We consider this monstrous. And we see this sentiment expressed in the prophecy of the chosen people in Deuteronomy, which, as we've just shown, might not have as much historical truth as we might think. This is the prophecy of the chosen people, and it is tied fundamentally to Jehovah, Yahweh, asking the Israelites to go into the promised land and destroy all the people around them. These grand prophecies are married to grand destructions. This great favor that Yahweh is offering to the Jews is married to the need for them to exterminate their enemies, to get rid of those people around them. So what we're seeing here is extreme nationalism, which Nietzsche is saying is based, is awesome. This is what you need. You need to go after life. You need to have that little bit of panache. Embrace the will to power. Don't be a moral cock. Be like, yeah, let's go exterminate the people of Jericho. Let's do this. That's what it means. It means to favor yourself, to choose yourself. This is a pagan religion in its origins. From Deuteronomy 7. And this is how you shall deal with those residing in the promised land. You must destroy their altars, and break down their images, and cut down their groves, and burn their graven images with fire. For you are a holy people unto the Lord your God, and the Lord your God has chosen you to be his own treasure, out of all people that are upon the face of the earth. So Nietzsche is psychologizing this, saying that this is the urge of will to power. This is healthy and normal to flatter yourself, to say, I'm the chosen people, I'm the best, I'm the conquerors, we're the ones who deserve to live, because that's what life has to think. This is what life must believe, that we must exist, to put yourself at the center of the story, to make yourself the main character. This is how it has to work. And so God here is a pagan nationalist, enacting vengeance against the people that threaten Israel and rewarding the loyalty of those who are Israel. Now you might say, I don't believe you. This is just your opinion, man. There was always a moral, loving God who loved all of the world back in prehistory, and maybe the chosen people were following him. And you're just making all this stuff up to suit yourself because you're some evil, twisted... Nietzsche has twisted your mind. And fair enough. How do I justify this perspective? How do I assert that God went through this type of evolution and originally he was a chud nationalist? Well, it comes again down to loading up all these different perspectives on the situation, going through as many different fields as possible to grasp firmly to the truth. So originally, people only had the writings to go on. And people like Nietzsche and Ernst Renan in the 19th century, they would use these writings to try to do a critical theory of sorts and psychologize what was happening in the Bible, which is where Nietzsche gets his ideas from. Since then, we've got archaeology like Dever, Finkelstein, and Adler. And what have they done? They've allowed us to see a different perspective hidden in the material world. And this tells us that there was some sort of ancient Yahwehistic religion that was polytheistic and pagan, and there was a transition point, Adler saying that it happened actually extremely recently, into monotheistic Judaism as we understand it. Now, I would like to also add into this the neuroscientific perspective, which is in some sense a marriage of these two forces, because psychology is a little bit, based on your opinion. It's based on all, your scatterbrained thoughts about writings and literature. And archaeology in the matter, it's a little bit dead. It's a little bit soulless. It's just looking at rocks and stones and pottery and stuff like this. Neuroscience is an interesting marriage. It is the exploration of the matter of your brain and watching how your brain creates psychological phenomenon. And you might say to yourself, well, is there any neuroscience on religious beliefs? And lo and behold, there is. What I'm going to present is a set of neural circuits that affect our religious consciousness. The first one is going to be the posterior medial frontal cortex. Now, I have made a video on this recently. I recommend you go and listen to that because it goes into this in rigorous depth and it will help you understand the context of what I'm talking about here. Now, I will also do a little bit of a crash course on this. So if someone has heard this before, I'm sure many of you had, just let's use it as a refresher as we go forward. In 2015, at the peak of the new atheist movement, a set of scientists took some magnets and tried to target parts of the brain to see where ideological and religious belief came from. Magnets are able to temporarily suppress the electrical signals in parts of your brain, causing them to essentially shut off. You could target your Broca's area and you wouldn't be able to talk for a couple of hours. And so these scientists targeted the posterior medial frontal cortex, whose role is to analyze obstacles and threats in reality. And what they noticed is that the people who had this done to them were more open to strangers, were less likely to see strangers as hostile and foreign. They were more open to immigrants and strangers who were critical of their country, the USA. And they were also at the same time, bizarrely, less likely to believe in God. Now, the volunteers they used for this were conservative, right-wing, God-fearing Americans because they specifically wanted to see, could they end bigotry within the souls of mankind? Had they found the hack to fix the brain, to, get rid of the bug of race nationalism? And of course, they were somewhat delighted. Try this one quick hack and you can get rid of racism and religious bigotry like that. The fatal flaw in all this is that this part of your brain evolved. It is there for a reason. And it turns out when you shut it off, it has other effects. You may become less racist, you may become less religious, but you also lose the ability to assess danger, so you become somewhat helpless. And you also lose the ability to solve problems, because you can't detect errors and assign energy to learn about them. So you lose the ability to adapt to new situations, to go to sleep and wake up having thought through a problem, and essentially to evolve at all. You transform into a dodo. Now, of course, this indicates to us that the natural moral orientation of the human mind is race, religious nationalism. To see yourself as God and country loving. For you to be a patriot under the cross and under the flag. For you to go out there and say, God chose me. God chose my team and my collective, and we're out there taking on the world because we're the chosen people, we're the good people, and everybody else is bad. This, of course, is Yahwehism. It is paganism. It is the natural religion of people all across the world at all times. And there's even more to this story, because the downside, it seems, of this part of your brain is when it is stimulated, it enhances cognitive dissonance. It's designed to watch your thoughts for conflicts, and when you're trying to make a moral decision that might go against your group, this posterior medial frontal cortex switches on cognitive dissonance to allow you to dismiss your inner thoughts, your conscience, what you believe is right, and allow you to pursue what is advantageous to the group, which will allow you to survive and participate in the collective. So this means this part of your mind that creates nationalism and religiosity and identity and helps you join in with a collective tribe is the part of your mind that allows you to lie to yourself. Because its intention is to give you a platonic, noble lie, to get you to say to yourself the most outrageous things that motivate you to participate in life. So this would include the idea that you're the chosen people, that you're the special race, that you're the most important people in the world and God chose you. When in truth, God is a manifestation of your collective's will to power. Of course, he's chosen you because he is you. He's an extension of you. He is the sort of super version of you, which is why Jupiter, the high god, is a super Roman, why Zeus is a super Greek, why Wodan is a super German. This is a natural way for us to orientate ourselves. And this ability for cognitive dissonance explains why identity can become so hilarious. Why? Because the Jews have this brilliant first principle identitarian religion, so many people tried to seize it off them. In Europe, there's been many traditions, such as the British Israelites, that have believed that the Europeans are the lost tribes of Israel and that the Jews are essentially imposters that have come in and stolen our destiny when we're the actual true people of Israel that have always followed the true religion. The black Israelites say the same thing, that Moses had a black wife and that they're the actual true people of Israel. And the Jews, again, are imposters, stealing the covenant, stealing this religion from themselves. And perhaps the Jews themselves are guilty of this from all the way in the past. They wanted to say that they were chosen so they could keep themselves motivated in absolute desolate situations, such as being in deep slavery. So they fabricate their old myths. They take things like the Hyksos and vague memories of the ancient past and spin them up into this grand story of Moses and covenants and promises and this one true God that they have apparently always followed. And this explains why religion and identity is so ferocious and so challenging, because it's engaging this part of our brain. And if somebody comes at you with a challenge to your ideology, this part of your brain is recognizing them as an existential threat and making you think, I got to hurt this person or attack this person or get rid of this person because they're trying to separate me from the collective and from God and leave me trapped as an individual, vulnerable to the dangers of the jungle and life. You even see this in the researchers. You have, for example, William Dever, and he goes through several iterations of being an evangelical American. He converts to Judaism briefly at one point and then becomes an atheist. As he's interacting with this knowledge, it's ripping his mind apart and throwing him all sorts of different directions. A further illustration of this I love to bring up is to look within Christendom at how we break down into race versions of our religion, because you would imagine in the Christian West, we all follow the same God, therefore we follow the same religion. But if you look at the genetic breakdown of Europe by Y haplogroups that are 5,000 years old, the recent religion of Christianity that came in the last 2,000 years kind of maps onto this. And all these things like Orthodoxy and Catholicism and Protestantism, they might seem like there's some sort of theological debate about all these nuances in the Bible, but weirdly they break down into genetic lines. And we see this all the time. We're using religion as a proxy to have race wars. The best example of this is Northern Ireland. People say, oh, that's a terrible religious war. There's all these religious wars going on. Yet again, the Bible is causing a religious war up in the north. But that's not the case. People say, are you Protestant? Because they really mean, are you one of the Scots planters who came into Ireland 400 years ago? And they say, are you Catholic? Because they mean, are you one of the native Gaels? That's a sorting mechanism. That's a very glossy way of saying which race are you, and they will fight on those terms. It's an ethnic war wearing the mask of religion. You look at the Y haplogroups of Protestant Europe, the Germanics basically, and they're usually the ones who become Protestant. You look at the Italio-Celts, the people who are from the Bell Beakers, the OR1b haplogroup that is so dominant, and they're majorly Catholic. That's the majority of their split. They go in this direction. You go over then into the Slavic realms, the OR1a and the Orthodox Church, and that's where it breaks down there. Now there are some, for example, anomalies. We have Poland. What the hell is going on with Poland? Well, interestingly, Poland is Catholic, but it suits this position because you have the Germanics to one side who they hate, who are Protestants, and you have the Slavs, the Russians to the other side, who they hate, who are Orthodox. So Catholic is a nice way to stick the finger up at your neighbors and stick to something that allows you to be aggressive. You also see this in the language. In the Catholic West, we follow Deus. Now, Yahweh asks us to call him Jehovah. He says, call me Yahweh, that's my real name, I'm the one true God. We call God Deus in the Catholic West, from Latin. In Gaelic Irish, we call him Dia. In Spanish, we call him Dios. In Portuguese, we call him Dia. It's this concept is present, that we're using a form of Deus from Latin, who is actually the name of Zeus, or more specifically, Deus Pater, the Indo-European religion, and therefore Jupiter, who is the Roman god. So despite the fact that we are following Christianity, we're following essentially the pagan version of this. You go over to the Slavs and you say, well, what do you call God? Do you call him Yahweh? Are you less sinful than us since you follow the true Orthodox religion? And they call God Ba, which is from Slavic paganism. Ba, Bog, this idea, it means divinity. It means the invocation. You go to Protestant Europe and you're like, all right, well, you guys, since you've figured out that we were all lying about the Bible, you're following Yahweh, aren't you? And they're like, no, we call him Gott. We call him mein Gott, God. This is an interesting one. This one comes from the Indo-European for invocation and divine. Some people argue, for example, that it may even come from a nationalist chosen people concept of the Goths who've invaded Rome, the Goths, the good, and the Goths. This is something that Nietzsche spoke about. And some people even say the Lombards used to call Wodan and Rodan, which turned into Godan. And then therefore, the Germanics are secretly worshipping God or Rodan in the background, something like this. Jung even says the Protestant God is Wodan wearing a dress. So these are these strange phenomenon. Out there in the Far East and the fringes of Europe, if you look at these maps, for example, look at the haplogroup maps, you will find that there's a pocket of, Mongolian DNA. And you look at their religion and it's Tibetan Buddhism. How does this even work? This is crazy. This little enclave is following a ethnic religion in order to differentiate itself from its neighbors. So the point here is that this phenomenon is omnipresent. If you are enjoying this and find it is full of rich and novel takes, like the application of neuroscientific principles to religion in ways you have not seen before, this is because I have drawn this out of the chapter of a book I am writing. Yes, the Boyo book is coming. Now, if you would like, you can join the waitlist for this book. This waitlist will be donation-based, so you can pay whatever you want, all the way down to $1 to $1 bazillion, whatever you so wish, however generous or not generous you're feeling. Once you're on this waitlist, I will release the audiobook to you for free when it is ready, and I will also give you a 50% discount for the physical copy. If that sounds thrilling, there will be a link down below that you can use to go to this waitlist. And now let us get back into our story. So Yahweh was originally a nationalist, and if we're seeing the potential for people to be fabricating parts of the Bible to give themselves a highly motivating story, this actually lines up with a healthy behavior that we see inside our own minds that we do all the time. We have cognitive dissonance tied to race nationalism, tied to religiosity, because that's what you need in order to live. You need to collectivize and join with an identitarian tribe to survive the dangerous world of the jungle. Now, what I want to show you is that the story that the Jews present in the Bible is one of encountering enormous threats, which we can only assume would stimulate this part of their mind, creating the conditions for them to have to shape a very strong religious identity, which is obviously the master key to their incredible resilience. How have the Jews endured thousands of years of literally not even having a country? It's because of the potency of this story. They created a sort of super-nationalism contained in a book that allowed them to get exiled and still sustain themselves. And the Old Testament itself betrays this phenomenon again and again. It shows you that it was written and fabricated a little bit later than it tells us in order to deal with specific threats. One of the best examples comes from Genesis. This is where the story of Abraham happens. Now, we would assume that this is 5,000 years old, at the beginning of time before Moses. But there's anachronisms in this story that mention camels and Philistines. Now, we know that camels and Philistines only show up in the Levant in the Iron Age, after, allegedly, when Exodus happens in the Bronze Age. after this period, because the Philistines are the sea peoples who invade out of Europe down into this period and destroy and end the Bronze Age and start the Iron Age. They arrive and show up and set themselves up in Gaza. So the people writing Genesis are mentioning these people who weren't even there when allegedly it happens. They are betraying themselves, slipping up a little bit, and showing the presence of their consciousness. They are in the Iron Age detailing out this information. It shows us that these works were written at this period of time. And of course, this would make sense because these Philistines were these tall invaders, these monsters about 5'9" on average, which is a couple of inches taller than the average native of Canaan. They were coming from the Indo-European lineages, it seems, so they would have been big guys and hyper-violent. These are, related to the people, it seems, who destroyed Troy. They were chuds coming to wreak havoc. And the consciousness of the people of Canaan at that period would have projected on them threats. They would have seen them as dangerous. And so they feature as a very prominent threat in this early formation of their consciousness. These monsters all around them. Goliath, who David kills, is a Philistine. That is a memory of a brave young Israelite killing one of these giant beasts that invaded the land. So this imposition of an outside force is turning on the pMFC and engaging religious collective identity. Because if there was no outside danger of threat, they would have all just been liberals. They would have become dodos in New Zealand, unable to understand predators, and became amorphous and would have been unable to understand it themselves. They would have just vanished and evaporated. But instead, these beasts come in and attack them, which creates collectivism. But the Philistines are little dolls compared to what comes next, the Assyrians. The Assyrians are one of the great Iron Age empires, and they were known for being particularly ruthless and brutal. They were a highly organized military force, like Sauron and Isengard, able to deploy armies across large swaths of land. And they would make their way all the way over to the Levant, and they would destroy Israel and deport the entire population into captivity. This was a strategy in the ancient world to dissipate collectivism, to destroy collective consciousness. They were coming in and they would encounter this tribe, was a strong pMFC, a really organized, clear identity, and a set of elites that are enforcing this identity. And they would come in and take those elites, split them up into large amounts of groups, and settle them all across the empire as farmers, breaking up their network and their identity, integrating them into the empire, and stopping them being a threat. The pMFC turns on and makes you identify the big Assyrian conqueror as a master moralist, as bad, as evil. So their strategy for subjugation was to destroy that consciousness, because that's the biggest threat. That's their psychological warfare. So the Jews were looking up at this going on, being like, bruh, this is scary. What's going on here? And the Assyrians begin to reach down into Judea, and we have from archaeology artifacts of reliefs they carved of when they went to the city of Lachish and besieged it and took out the population after they defeated it, took the commanders and skinned them alive in front of the population in order to install terror, because this is another act of psychological warfare, to overwhelm them with fear and terror so you buckle the knee and kneel at the feet of these monsters. Now, this is a crucial part in the story because the Assyrians don't conquer Judea. They essentially leave them alone and let them become a buffer state on the outskirts of their enormous empire. Now, the story in the Bible is that the Assyrians tried to invade Jerusalem with 200,000 men, and some angels went out and wiped out their camp in the middle of the night, so the Assyrians gave up on this idea. Now, there's a problem here because the Assyrians in their own records boast about being able to deploy 120,000 men nearby their empire, which is incredible for the time. They boast about their logistical power. They're like Isengard, So how were they able to get 185,000 people down to Jerusalem? That's a bit of an exaggeration. And in all likelihood, what happens is the king of Judea at the time is seeing these beasts show up and saying like, I'll get skinned alive and so will all of my people. I do want to protect them. I don't want them to get destroyed. So what we should do is probably set up a deal with these guys, be conservative. Now you actually see this in some of the early prophets like Isaiah. Isaiah is constantly talking about the importance of remaining conservative, not poking the bear with Assyria, these giant, horrible, threatening monsters. You know, this is like Sauron coming across the land. It's like, let's not draw attention to ourselves. Israel and the northern tribes, before they get conquered, are actually poking at Judea, saying, come on, let's start a fight. Let's go and form a coalition and fight, because these guys are going to come get us. And Isaiah and all them are saying, no, let's not get all wrought up. Let's not go into this crazy paganism and take these people on, because we'll be in trouble. Let's be conservative and hold ourselves back and try to just endure this monster that is swooping across the land. And this leads up to when Israel Finkelstein believes that most of Deuteronomy in the Old Testament was formed and shaped, because they become a vassal state to Assyria. They're paying tribute. They're standing as this buffer state. They're not this important metropolis. They're this kind of like small countryside place. And they just hang out there and they manage to survive. All is well. And then as Assyria begins to weaken, a king rises up, Josiah, and he sees the potential for carving out his little nation and establishing his little national project. As this big beast is falling apart, the little nationalism can switch on. And he is lucky enough to discover a book of the law. His priests are looking through the temple and they find this book locked in one of the back rooms, and they read it out to Josiah, and he says, whoa, wow, we're following the wrong version of our religion. Our religion is not not doing it very well. We need to do a set of reforms. We need to centralize authority in Jerusalem and move all of our religious nationalism here. So there's this purge that takes place. All the shrines in the countryside, some of them start to get burned. It's clear that something is actually happening here, where people are beginning to chimp out and try to organize the religion properly. And also, this is where we get the social context that makes sense for the story of the Exodus to take place. Because remember, the Hyksos were invaders in the story of Exodus who went into Egypt and then, came out themselves. So they were conquerors. They were the sadists. But instead, the story we get is that Egypt was the oppressor that wanted to enslave the people of Israel and take the promised land from them. Now, of course, this suits Josiah at the time, because as Assyria falls, who's going to be the big bad people on the block? The Egyptians. These Egyptians are coming back with power, and they move up and they begin to invade up through Judea up into the falling Assyrian Empire. So he can obviously see this beast that is coming, and he's saying, right, the promised land is this useful perimeter that I'd like to have, and these Egyptians are going to be the big bad boys that we don't want to come in. So we spin this story of a promised land, of a Joshua, of a great conqueror, a one true religion centralized in this place. And then we have this beast of the Egyptians coming up to take it from us. And Josiah is unfortunately unlucky and ends up dying quite early before he can claim this promised land, before he can secure safety for his people. And the next kings that come afterwards aren't as serious as him, it seems. The prophets often complain about them. And Babylon within 20 years shows up, and they terminate Judea. They come in and they say, listen, you guys are resisting us. You should have learned what you did with the Assyrians and done it again. You didn't. You're going to stand up to us. So we're going to invade Jerusalem and we're going to wipe this off the face of the earth. We're going to destroy you. The Babylonians, like the Assyrians before them, realized that they need to shut off nationalism, and deportations and scattering is an excellent way to do this. And this is where the Jews must get some credit. They resisted this very well. Their state was taken from them, and there was an attempt to distribute them and assimilate them in a broad super empire, and they held on to their identity. They created essentially the first network state, which was a great opposition to this. And for this reason, most of the scholarship rests on the idea that the foundations of the Torah and a lot of these writings about this religion were crafted in this period. For example, the anachronism of the Tower of Babel. You would think this happened in prehistory, thousands of years before, because this is when it's presented in the story. But we already know that Genesis has a couple of problems with camels and Philistines. Well, this is another one, because the Tower of Babel is described as an abandoned tower representing, arrogance, representing this globo homo arrogance of creating a diversity empire, this type of thing. But you have these Judeans, and they would have come into Babylon, and they would have seen a giant ziggurat, which is a temple to Marduk, that would have been in a state of disrepair because the conqueror of Babylon was trying to rebuild it at the time, but he very quickly is going to get conquered by the Persians and won't be able to achieve it. So their experience would come in and see this massive structure. Remember, these are like tribesmen from the hills of Judea, and they come in and they say this like 400-foot tall super tower that's like half put together. They're coming in, and there's all these people from all around the world speaking in all these different tongues, and these giant Babylonian conquerors are trying to take them in and absorb them so that they can create this giant Untermensch state that they rule over. And the Judeans would have perceived this as a symbol of their arrogance, a symbol of them attempting to assimilate and mix together all these people in their arrogant super empire that is bound to fall, which soon would fall. Now we see how these innovations appear most clearly in the prophets, which is the subjective, emotional presentation of what the Jews are going through at this point. And there are a lot of critical things to understand here. We have Isaiah, who is split into 2 or 3 sections, Isaiah 1, 2, and 3, which are considered to be written at different times. And this means that Isaiah 1 presents more of a context of the Assyrians, and it's talking about, the need to remain conservative and avoid the coalitions of Israel and, stick to the God. Jeremiah, who comes after him, who's constantly saying the people of Judea need to hold fast to their religion, stay with Yahweh, obey these reforms by Josiah, and become a strong nation that's capable of maintaining its freedom and independence, a good instinct within people. When Judea falls, you get Ezekiel and Isaiah 2, where the tone changes a lot. Ezekiel is an exile, and he has an experience and vision of God as a mobile God with a chariot of fire holding him up. Some people say he's a UFO, God in a flying saucer, but you could also interpret it as the beginning of the network state version of Yahweh, of this mobile spirit that goes around with the collective, and they can all be held together despite the fact that they no longer have a state, which is a critical innovation that defines Judaism as we understand it. The ability for them to maintain themselves as this race nationalist collective. Other nations have blood and soil, but the Judeans are able to say, we are blood, we are the collective, we are the people of the religion. The religion and the blood are all merged together in this way, which allows them to get transported into Babylon and have this resilience to survive through this place. And Isaiah 2 is where we get a lot of prophecies of the suffering servant. And this may be Israel. Some people say it is the Messiah, perhaps even Jesus. But it is this idea of the pain, the suffering you're going through now, you must do in service to this mobile God. And then there will be a restoration later. We'll get the country back. Just maintain hope. I know you've been deported, but hold out hope and things will work out. And this is incredibly important because the entire point of deportation is to eviscerate this consciousness out of people. But this group of scribes are innovators, are genius, and they work very hard to maintain this pMFC, this collective identity, despite the danger and the stress. Now, here's an interesting way of thinking about what the prophets are doing. They are informing the Jungian collective unconscious of the Judeans and filling it up with stories and informations and visions that are going to develop the correct moral attitudes to keep them motivated. They are creating inside of the collective memory a block of information that stops people getting despaired and falling apart. Now, there's neural substructures that literally do this. 2 of them that I want to bring up specifically. The problem here is that the scientists don't have really sexy names for this. We've got the dmPFC and the vmPFC. Now, these are both part of the prefrontal cortex. One of them is sitting on top, and it is the DM, or dorsal medial, and then the other one is the ventral medial, which is underneath it, just above your eyes. You can think about it this way. And they do 2 distinct roles in religious thinking. So the dmPFC, which is, around about your forehead, this is the one that creates the consciousness of God. And they notice this in religious people when you ask them about their beliefs or ask them about moral decisions. The dmPFC will turn on, and it will seem like they are projecting an image in their minds of what the God consciousness is thinking of them. So it's like a pressure and shame and fear and outside questioning force inside of the mind. You can imagine it like a man in the sky phenomenon, where you begin to imagine, what does the face of God looking down on you want out of you? What is God doing if he's watching me all the time, like Santa Claus, this type of thinking? How would that affect your actions? Of course, it would get you to act more moral if you think about it. So this is morality in accordance with, how will this help the group? How would this affect the group? And how would I be judged by the group? It's highly linked to empathy, and it's almost like a form of collective empathy. So if you imagine the prophets as installing information into that face of God in the sky that this part of the brain seems to connect to, you are seeing them essentially computer coding the collective energy or identity of these people who've been distributed all across the world, which helps them all connect to this force and connect to this way of thinking that helps them stay coherent despite them losing their nation. What a genius innovation. They are installing information into the Jungian collective unconscious, which feeds back as assisting life. And of course, this dmPFC is tightly connected to the posterior medial frontal cortex, that other part of the brain that I brought up earlier. Now, the vmPFC, which is at the bottom of the front of your brain, this is a critical part of your brain for understanding guilt and reward and anticipating what is to come in the future emotionally. Now, a simple way you can understand this is through the trolley problem, that famous philosophy problem where there's a train going and some set of guys, 5 people, are going to get squished by this train, but in front of you there's a lever, and if you pull that lever it will divert the train, but on that other track is one guy who's going to get killed. Now you have this conundrum where if you do nothing, 5 people die, but you haven't participated in their death, or if you do something, 1 person dies, but then you will be guilty of committing an action that led to murder. What do you do? And this is a paradox. It's a very difficult question to answer. You can make what we call a utilitarian choice, where you do the mathematics and you say 5 people dying is worse than 1 person dying, therefore I will pull the lever and the 1 person will die. But actually the majority of people don't pull the lever because they get feelings of guilt, and they say, if I pull that lever and I kill someone, that will feel bad, I shouldn't do that. They have this regulation where they don't want to commit a moral sin. It's worse to actually do an action that's immoral than it is to let something bad happen that you're not a part of. Now, this is an interesting part of the human mind, but get this. When this vmPFC is damaged, people can quite easily make the utilitarian decision. They can quite easily walk over and pull the lever and have this one guy get killed and save the 5 people. They don't think beforehand, oh God, this will make me feel bad. But it gets even more interesting. When they pull the lever, when the person gets squished, after it happens, then they get overwhelmed with guilt, and the emotion boils up and takes them over. So it's not like they don't feel guilt. It's that they can't anticipate that they're going to feel the guilt in the future. So they're facing this moral decision and they can't understand that this moral decision that they're about to make, pull the lever, is going to make them feel bad. Because this is what the vmPFC does. It helps us understand emotions we will feel in the future based on actions now. Think about that. That's very interesting. So the emotions are like the chthonic under God forces that are swelling up inside of our souls, and the vmPFC is able to watch them and say, if you pull that lever, guilt will come up and take you. Regret will come up and take you. So don't do it. It's almost like our conscience, our guardian angel, whispering in our ears, telling us the bad things that will come. Like Athena grabbing Achilles' hair. It's this type of character. That's pretty wacky. Now, this part of our brain also helps us understand positive emotions that will come. So if we're going through stress and pain, we can anticipate that there will be a reward in the future, and we can develop resilience in the face of this reward. And this is activated in people who use spiritual or religious thinking, because it is usually telling them time can get better, stay true, don't commit the sins, don't give in to your impulses, and sustain yourself, and the reward will come in the future. And lo and behold, this part of your brain also activates during prayer and religious ritual. It switches on to engage with this experience. Now, this really makes sense in regards to things like Ezekiel and Isaiah 2 and the prophets trying to promise that there will be a future that will be good. It is stimulating this part of the brain saying, trust the plan, stick to it, stay resilient. Even though you're enduring a serious amount of stress right now, the rewards will come in the future. Just trust in the collective, trust in God, trust in Yahweh, and we will get our country back. Their tenacity and their resilience serves them well, because then the Persians come in out of the northern hills and they conquer Babylon and claim it for themselves. And Cyrus the Great is taking a new approach to empires. He wants to be a bit more of a nice guy. He's a Zoroastrian, so he's informed an awful lot more about morality. And you'll notice this phenomenon as we evolve forward out of prehistory. The way of controlling large territories is you have to actually balance an awful lot of your savagery, of your terror, with magnanimity, with, this master morality presence of grace, of mercy. Now, you might know the Persians as Xerxes in the Spartan 300 with his army of slaves, but the Persians actually had these large armies because they were quite nice, because they were quite friendly. They were innovators in human rights at the time, and they were very good logisticians. They set up post offices and things like this. So Cyrus got a lot of credit. He was called Cyrus the Great. He allowed the Jews to go back to their homeland, and this is phenomenal. And the idea here is they returned, they set up the second temple. And a lot of scholars think this is when we really see Judaism become formalized and transform into what it is. It is not stretching back into ancient history. It is a gradual evolution that takes old myths and reshapes them to suit the political climate of the time, which eventually culminates in this moment where they're able to get a restoration of their state and they establish a strong nationalist religion in celebration and formalize it into what we understand as Judaism. An incredible story of resilience, hope, and restoration, but there is a catch. During the turmoil of the Babylonian exiles, some Jews hop on some boats and flee down to the bottom of the Egyptian Nile to the island of Elephantine. They set up a community there and they hold out. This is their version of exile. Now, they stay there for centuries, even after the Babylonian exile ends. Now, I was first informed about this little island by a Gnostic informant last year, and he explained that the oldest physical evidence we have of the Jewish religion in text comes from this island. Before that, we don't have anything written down. We do have this idea, this implication based on what we're reading, that there's oral traditions that probably stretched back hundreds of years before this. But we don't actually have documents. We have the Elephantine papyri, and then next after that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they're hundreds of years later. So what we have in these documents are critical. They're by far the strongest evidence we have of what Jews were practicing in 500 BC. And when you read them and look at their religious structure, they mention Yahweh. They follow Yahweh. The pagan nationalism that we spoke about before, it's there. They are following this, but they have a temple to Yahweh. Now, we know that that's a big no-no. The temple is supposed to be in Jerusalem. You're not allowed to have another temple. Some people say, well, listen, these guys are all the way to the other end of Egypt. How could they know? The problem is that they sent a letter. They phone called Jerusalem and they said, our temple is kind of a bit ruined. Do you mind if we build another one? And the high priest in Jerusalem said, yeah, sure. Sure, buddies. Go ahead. So Jerusalem knew about this temple. They were in communication. They were only 2 or 3 days away via boat. And Jerusalem was okay with this. This is the hardcore monotheist religion that has one sacred temple in Jerusalem. It's starting to turn into a bit of a problem. But it gets worse again. These guys don't mention Moses. They don't speak about Deuteronomy. They don't even talk about the Torah. They're not aware of this. It's not present. Now, you can make an argument and say, well, maybe they didn't find any religious texts. That's the problem. These are just legal documents, discussions about this temple they're trying to maintain, various letters. But this is a very difficult issue. This is the oldest physical manuscripts we have. People say, yes, the Dead Sea Scrolls are rooted in something older, but physically they've radiocarbon dated those to 200 BC. These things are not as old as what they found in Elephantine. And since the archaeology already suggests that many of the early stories are unreliable, probably fabrications from later in the history of the Jewish people, we have to look at the evidence we have instead of assuming based on the evidence we do not. And this is one of the strongest arguments of the minimalist perspective, that Elephantine is proof that the Yahwehistic pagan religion was still being practiced in 500 BC. And the arrival of Torah Judaism with the formalized text, the only physical evidence we have of that is after 250 BC. So we need to say something happened between those two dates that tell us when a revolution and an innovation took place. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Jonathan Adler looks at the archaeology to try trace when he sees evidence of this formal Torah Judaism being practiced, the actual behavior of normal people. And he says it's not present until the Hellenic Empire of Alexander the Great, and actually the late parts of this as it's falling apart. Now, the way Jonathan Adler comes to his conclusions are very important because he takes a narrow focus. He explicitly says he is not interested in intellectual or elite history. Perhaps the elite were practicing something like Torah Judaism for centuries before they could get the common people to catch up with them. That could be possible. He doesn't care. He says that's not his area of speculation. That's not what he considers good science, because it's just saying over and back, oh, well, I believe this, I read history, I believe this. He's a strict archaeologist. So he takes a narrow focus and looks for artifacts so that he can confirm with absolute authority when Judaism was practiced among the common people. Because remember, the intellectual history could be a network of 10 people inside a temple and some elites, whereas the population of 100,000 could be doing something completely different. So he's trying to find out what the population are doing when this is getting followed. That is his criteria, which means that he doesn't speculate, which means that he's very precise. And then all the speculation can be left up to people like me, which I'm sure he'd probably disagree with some of the things I say, but I am building on the back of his hard evidence, so you can study his evidence for yourself. Now, one of the points of evidence he brings up is the use of idols and images and representational art, because, as we know, Deuteronomy commands that you must destroy the graven images of your enemies and you must not follow golden calves yourself, follow the one true God. So the practice of Torah Judaism is not using idols. So if we start in 0 BC at the time of Jesus, when there's lots of Jews around, well, we look at their settlements and we discover that their coins, that statues, none of that is there. They don't use idols. So we can say for certain, around Jesus' time, 0 AD, they are not using idols. They are not using graven images. So that's for certain. Go back 100 years, it's the same thing. You discover that that's not going on. Now, when you start to get to 200 years and 300 years, you start to notice a huge uptick in the amount of idols and the amount of use of animal images and human faces on coins and art, various things like this. Now, it's not like we have an absence of Jewish art before that. Around about Jesus' time, we have loads of Jewish art, mosaics, abstract colors, we have patterns, this type of thing. So they are making art, but they're not using idols. Go back 250 years, and then all of a sudden, they're using idols, they're putting in household idols. We have this problem of polytheism showing up. It seems like they might have been practicing something sort of like this. And their coins even have with things like Greek gods on them. So it seems like they're not taking Torah Judaism very seriously. So we can't really say they're practicing it because they're using idols. They're using this representational art. That drops off at some point, indicating that there's a huge cultural transformation that takes place. The imposition of the Torah laws, the religious laws. So this happens only 200 years before Jesus, which is extremely late from how we would understand it. Jonathan says, one of the things that really stands out is the coins. Judeans were minting coins during quite a number of periods of time. We have Judean coins from the 1st century of the Common Era never depicting humans or animals. The same is true of the 1st century before the Common Era. This is the 100 years after Jesus and before Jesus. So this is very clear. But then when we get to the Hasmonean period, which is this rebellion that takes place at the end of Alexander the Great's empire, the fall of the Hellenic Greek empires, the Judean state breaks away, and this is the Hasmonean, the Maccabee revolt period. What we see is there is the arrival of this new type of coin, which instead of getting an image of a king, of a Judean king, we get a textual portrait. Basically, they write down, big chud badass king Wazir on this coin. This is mandated by this. So this means that they're minting coins, but now they're choosing not to use idols. Now we go before this, we go into the 4th century before the Common Era, and every single coin minted by Judeans is displaying animals and even foreign gods like Athena. Jonathan says that we have one coin that has the name of the Judean high priest, Jonathan Hakohen, it says in Hebrew, and in the middle of the coin it has the owl of Athena. So this is representational art coming from someone of high religious authority, which is quite damning to the idea that the priests and the scribes were following the Torah religion and everybody else was not. This is quite undermining of that thesis and quite shocking when you really think about what it means. Now, another point of evidence is immersion pools, because Leviticus is telling the people of Judea, if they want to follow Judaism, they have to ritualistically cleanse themselves. They have to purify themselves. And you can't purify yourself with, just a random pottery pot that you throw water over yourself. You need to specifically do it with stone vessels. And this might be, for example, made of chalk, because Leviticus says that you don't need to worry about stone. Stone does not make you impure. Stone can be used as something that is pure. So therefore, these purity pools that we find in Judean sites are quite common. Wherever you find a Judean site, you're going to find these structures, these purity pool structures. And then in non-Judean sites in the areas around it, they won't have these things. So this is clearly a trait of Judean culture. Now the problem, of course, is again, before Maccabees, before the Hasmonean period, before the fall of the Hellenic Empire, we do not have these pools. So these pools only show up in the 200 years before Jesus. It's quite recent, all things considered. Now the next point of evidence that he goes into is in dietary laws. When do we find the Judeans are abstaining from pork? Now there's a bit of nuance with this, because if you want to discover this, you would have to go into a site and see what bones of animals are there, indicating what they're eating. So if there's lots of cow bones or goat bones, we'd be like, right, these guys are eating ruminants. But if there's no pig bones, we'd say, right, they're avoiding pork. And that would mean then, oh, wow, they're practicing Judaism. You might think, but that's not exactly true, because there could be other nuances and problems. Maybe, for example, cows get sick and then you can't have them, or maybe cows are too expensive, you're in a desert, it's hard to get grass, or maybe pigs are hard to take care of for whatever reason. So sometimes there can be economical reasons that you avoid foods. For example, in Ireland, we're surrounded by an ocean, but we don't really eat fish that much. Fish is not very popular in Ireland. It's very popular in Spain, but it's not popular in Ireland because we have so many cows. So maybe people in the future will be like, oh, these guys couldn't fish. They're idiots, And this is like, no, we just had such massive cows and so much milk. We didn't need fish. We're not dorks. We're not little fish cooks. We're gonna use our cows like proper Indo-Europeans. Now, this is the same thing. That's not a dietary taboo. That's not a religious law. That's just a sort of pattern of history. So when we look into the data on the appearance of pig bones and the disappearance of pig bones, we do find that, again, in this recent era after the fall of Alexander the Great's empire and the arrival of the Judea period, yes, pig bones vanish, indicating that they're not using them. Now, before that, pig bones do show up, but going back into history, it's not consistent. Sometimes there'll be parts of Judea or certain cities that don't have pigs, and it kind of scatters. Sometimes there will be pig bones, and there'll be Canaanite tribes and Philistines that don't have pig bones and then do have pig bones. And there's all this transformation and morphing. And this is indicating that, yes, there might have been a problem with scarcity of pigs, various things like this, but it doesn't become systematic, it seems, until this Torah era at the fall of the Hellenic empires. So at the end of his book, Jonathan makes his suggestion about how Judaism came into being. He said it was the Hasmoneans who likely adapted or took the Torah and applied it, made it practical. Perhaps the Torah was floating around for a while before that, again among the intellectual elite, but the practitioners, the people who brought it into being, brought the thesis into reality, were these Hasmoneans breaking away from the Hellenic Empire. Now, this is speculative. We don't have any direct evidence of the Hasmoneans getting together and saying, all right, this is what we're going to do, this is our plan. But we do have evidence from the political and military sphere looking at what they did as they seized territories and integrated them into this new blossoming Judean state. And this is to do with forced conversions circumcision in order to get citizenship, and the imposition of Torah law. So it seems like they were going around to their neighbors, conquering them, and imposing this religion upon them, saying, you're going to follow Torah Judaism now, you're going to get circumcised, you're going to follow one God, screw your God is done, and you're going to follow this law. This is an assimilation project in order to absorb everybody into this identity. Jonathan explains that we know, for example, that the Hasmoneans conquered the Edomites in the south of the country. This was a non-Judean ethnic group that worshipped a god named Kyos, and the Hasmoneans conquered them around the year 112 BC and enforced the laws of the Torah on the domains. We would say today they forced conversion on the Edomites. What the sources tell us, and we have textual sources which tell us this, Josephus and others, they tell us that the Hasmoneans forced them to be circumcised and to keep the laws of the Torah. We know that Judah, Aristobulus I, conquered a people in the north called the Etrurians, and he did the same thing. He forced them to circumcise and to keep the laws of Torah. This is the modus operandi of the Hasmoneans as they're making their state. Circumcision and obedience to this Torah was the condition for citizenship. Get circumcised, obey the Torah, or get exiled. And then Jonathan goes on to say, I think it's not much of a stretch to imagine that perhaps the earlier Hasmoneans, let's say Simon or Jonathan or Judah Maccabee, perhaps did this very thing to the Judeans themselves and brought the laws of the Torah to the Judeans, enforced the laws of the Torah on the Judeans themselves. And we would have the emergence of what I call Judaism. Now that's pretty interesting. Now Jonathan being narrow and refusing to speculate beyond this is good because it means that his evidence is quite solid. So this brings us to our next question. Now, why would Alexander the Great's Hellenic Empire be such a stimulus of this? Why would this be such a crucial pivot point? This is only about 250 years before Jesus Christ himself shows up. So this is incredibly late. This is crazy. But the idea here is that the Hellenics, they approached statecraft in a very interesting way. They weren't like the Assyrians tyrannizing people, breaking their will with terror, ripping off their skin. They actually innovated an awful lot with soft power. They waged a culture war. If you look at modern America projects its globo-homo energy all across the world. It uses Hollywood and McDonald's in order to erode the cultural customs and has absorbed them into the American empire. It's a cultural powerhouse that erodes nationalism, makes nationalism taboo. It says that nationalism is backwards. Oh, your pMFC is turned on and you're a racist. You're a backwards person. You're a bad person. Instead, we want to be open. We want to be this American dream to the world, a liberal world empire that hoovers everybody up inside of it. Now, Hellenism was in many ways the same. Alexander was the master conqueror who took over this incredibly large territory, and he brought with him Greek culture, which had just gone through one of the first revolutions in culture in human history. Nietzsche called the Greeks the first instance, the first step in human culture, where we saw this explosion of theater, philosophy, writing, the genius and love for the body, almost like the first Renaissance is the way to think about it, that set the foundation of a higher standard of human thinking forever, permanently. They progressed mankind forward. So Alexander was quite lucky because as he was conquering, he was bringing with him rational thinking, free thinking, critical thinking, reason, science, glorious, cool new art. It's like cinema showing up, it just mogs everything else that is present. And this becomes the cultural substrate of Hellenism. And instead of oppressing all these smaller cultures, it actually absorbs them and mogs them, outcompetes them, makes them look weaker and backwards and less intellectual and less intelligent. So you can imagine you're in Judea, and we have these great Hellenic powers presenting to you bodybuilding, the gymnasium, theater, which is like cinema, philosophy, writing, thinking, all this sexy imaginative stuff. And then you've got all these Yahwehists being like, come back into the collective. Turn your pMFC on. Be afraid of these guys. Come and let's hang around in our little temple, in our little hovels in the rural part of our country. And, young people would be like, this sucks. This is terrible. This is backwards. I want to go into the city and find new things and express myself and become an individual. I want to enjoy the globo-homo culture that these Hellenics are presenting me, this homogenized superculture that sits over everything. Now, the Hellenics are genius because they really target the urban elite, which is the thinking administrative center of a culture. So what you see in Judea in this time is writings from people around the Maccabean revolt that are discussing this problem. There's this cultural war taking place, this psychological war taking place, where the rural, backwards traditionalists, the trads, are saying all these yuppies, these traitor libtards in Jerusalem, they're going over to Hellenism. And they try to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. And they try to, Hellenize Judean culture. And they're like, this sucks. What are we doing? No, we're assimilating. We're getting homogenized. We're getting buck broken by the all-powerful globo-homo empire. And this is an escalating point of tension, but it doesn't break out into war until the Hellenic empires become weak, until they reach their point of collapse like the Assyrians, and the same pattern repeats. The Assyrians were collapsing, and so Josiah can try pull the vassal state of Judea away for himself. And now in this situation, the Hellenic Empire is falling apart, and so the Jews are trying to pull away. The Maccabees want to create and craft their own little space and their own little state. They're turning the pMFC on, and they're trying to purge the libtards, the globo-homo urbanites. They're trying to get rid of them and return back to a trad state. And of course, this requires them to do a little bit of retroactive engineering. It's like us. We're all sitting here saying, oh, globo-homo culture is destroying all of our cultures, so we want to do a new nationalism. We want to create our own new identity. We want to do identity politics and become European right-wing chuds and revive the Europeans. And so we're retroactively trying to engineer, what was tradism even like? How would tradism fit with the modern times? We're actually sort of trapped in our circumstance where we have to innovate. We have to flourish a little bit. We have to, put it together based on our circumstance, not really based on how it actually was. And so what came out of this was the proper transition out of Yahwehism into formal Judaism. This is what Yoatan Adler is pointing out. The reason why the archaeological record only shows this transition happen after this Maccabean revolt is because of this. Because they win their state and they establish essentially this new religion that's monotheist, that's focused on circumcision, that's focused on this taboo against pork, that creates this separateness, that creates this strong identity that can resist these homogenizing forces which are now retreating and falling away. And this is where we get to the most controversial intellectual of our four thinkers. This is Russell Gmurkin. Now, he does largely textual analysis, which is probably why people call him fringe an awful lot. He's not grounding it in evidence-based archaeology as much. But Russell claims that the Jewish religion was engineered in the Hellenic Empire by groups of scribes that were going into these urban globo-homo libraries where the Greeks were gathering together all this information and filling these libraries up with these large amounts of books and this highly sophisticated information like Plato on how to create states and how to engineer religions. And they basically read all this stuff, cross-examined it with their own myths, and constructed the foundation of a new religion which was deployed during the Maccabee revolt, which was Judaism. And there's definitely some shapes here that fit. For example, there's Plato's Laws and Plato's Republic, which discuss how to construct a state. The need to take your people's ancient religious stories and morph them into a noble lie. These are Plato's ideas, which will then serve as a motivating high pMFC identity. You need to tell them that the constitutional laws that make up your state were given to you far in the ancient times. This is important to say so people have conviction about them. You need to understand that the first generation might be a bit skeptical, but after that first generation, the new kids will be conditioned and they will believe this. This is all written inside Plato. Plato's like hardcore Machiavelli, how to create and organize, how to string up a state. This is all there. But it gets even better. Let's look at the star of the show, God. Plato had the idea of a monotheistic God. In Timaeus, he discusses how the universe was created. He says that the demiurge, which means the architect, built reality. And the demiurge, according to Plato, is a benevolent and intelligent being, often interpreted as a divine craftsman or a godlike figure. He is described as good and free from jealousy, desiring to make the world as good as possible. The demiurge is eternal and unchanging, existing outside the material world, and he works with reason and intelligence. The demiurge organizes pre-existent chaotic matter into an ordered cosmos, using the eternal forms as a blueprint. He shapes the universe to resemble the perfect eternal model of the forms, aiming to make it as beautiful and as good as possible. The demiurge creates the physical world, including the heavens, stars, and living beings, by imposing order on chaos through mathematical proportions and harmony. I've heard of that guy before. That sounds like someone I'm familiar with. Now, the thing with Plato is that most people will say nowadays that, oh yeah, well, Plato figured out the one true God that the Yahwehites had figured out for thousands of years. But we're just after discussing the archaeological and historical problems that suggest that Torah Judaism was put together 100 years after Plato put this stuff down. Remember, Plato came before Alexander. He came before those conquests. The Greek Golden Age comes from 500 BC up until the 350 BC when Alexander rips out into the world. So Plato was already there. He had put this stuff down into pen. And he himself was saying that there was this problem. This is a philosophical conundrum you see throughout Socrates and Plato's writings where, okay, the old gods are clearly sort of mysticism, memories. They're kind of like vague myths that understand reality. But the true reality is this demiurgic creator who's kind of far off in distance. And these mathematical formulae that make up the substance of the world, they're a critical part of reality. And we have an issue where we need to lead people towards this good, these mathematical formulae that were put there by the demiurge that will make things beautiful and strong. But, the people are retarded, so they want their myths. So we have to kind of be the mediators, where we're the enlightened philosopher kings, the priests that lead them towards this idealism. This would have been centerpiece to an awful lot of the highest intellectual work in Alexandria. Alexandria was a giant globo homo, merging and blending of all people all across the world coming and trying to interact with universal truths. It would have been imposing on people this shutting down of the pMFC to open people's minds and make them more liberal, make them more open-minded. Get over your collectivized close-mindedness following your old paganism, and let's join together in Egypt and Alexandria and try to think through what is the true high truths, what is the Platonic philosophical project. And so we have all these people from Judea who would have come into this malaise and seen all this and interacted with this. And so Gomurkin is saying that it was in this moment in Alexandria that scribes from Judea came in and they worked to take their people's old Yahwehistic myths and to modernize them, to make them sophisticated and lead them towards these high goods and say, okay, God came and chose us and wants to lead us from our old ancient tradition with Moses and Exodus towards the good. And that's a completely normal and rational thing. You want to motivate your people as an enlightened scribe towards the good. Who doesn't want to do that? That's fine. So Gomurkin's theory is an alignment between the problem of Elephantine, where we have this Yahwehistic religion, but no Moses, none of this, and then Jonathan Adler pointing out that the archaeology only really kicks off as the Hellenic Empire is falling down. And Gomurkin is pointing out that in between these, there was this moment where the Hebrew texts were translated into Greek, called the Septuagint, where 70 scribes came from Judea, probably sponsored by one of the kings, and they wanted to, construct or formalize their religion. And the point here is that there was no Exodus or no Moses mentioned at any time ever before this date. So we have this problem where these guys come in and they seem to be translating these works, but how do we know that this wasn't the crafting of these works? Sure, they must have taken some documents and some memory of their people and tribal stories, but we've already established that a lot of these stories reveal anachronisms and pieces of engineering. Why can't we assume that something like this took place as well during this well-funded moment? Formalized Judaism with the best ideas around them in the world. And they had every motivation to do this. There was an Egyptian writer who basically said all the Jews were lepers. They were the early forms of lepers. So they're these little gremlin monsters, these golems. And so they're like, wait a second now, right? We can't go around having people say we're these monsters, we're these bad people. So let's go and let's give ourselves a motivating story. Let's go and defend ourselves against this slander calling us decrepits. And so as the theory goes, in the Library of Alexandria, they now had crafted a better national myth, and then right as the Hellenic Empire begins to collapse, they use this to give themselves a strong cultural identity, a rigid and energetic nationalism that says, oh yes, the divine God that Plato talks about in Timaeus, yes, he's real, and we need to reach up towards him, and he has chose us to be mediators to the world. We're not lepers, we're not these monsters, we're actually very important, we're special, we're supposed to be the moral conduits of this, and we should fight for our religion and fight for our people and secure ourselves. And the Maccabees come and say we should have a revolt and claim this territory for ourselves to re-establish our identity and our true religion, our moral religion, against all these degenerates that are all around us. And of course, what happens as the Alexandrian Empire gets weak, as the Hellenics get weak, one of their leaders begins to chimp out. He loses the grace of soft power. He no longer can act persuasive. He has to start using violence. He goes in and tries to bully the Jews, and this stimulates the pMFC. It gets them riled up and angry, and the grace of soft power falls apart, and people start to hate him. They're like, you know what, Maccabees, you're right. Let's chud out against these guys. Screw them. I don't like them anymore. We're up for a fight, and it's a fight that they win. So the minimalist argument hinges on these core pieces of evidence. The elephantine problem, the Septuagint appearing in the Library of Alexandria, and Adler pointing out that the archaeology is basically running dry before that moment, and the Maccabee revolt, where we know for certain there was huge amounts of pressure on Jewish nationalism from the globo-homo force of Hellenism. So the idea here is that the religious project was born in this moment. It was a political innovation at the time that had just been engineered in the great libraries of the world, and it had received much of what came out of the philosophical canon that was there at the time. And this might explain why the next series of events take place in the way they do. Now, this is definitely me theory selling here a little bit, so you're free to dismiss whatever you want. I just offer you some thoughts. As usual, a big empire comes and conquers Judea. In this instance, it is Rome. Now, if you know your biblical history, you'll know that this is when Jesus shows up. And you'll also know that during this period, there was a lot of different factions in Judea. There was these hard, high pMFC super nationalists called the Zealots, where we get the idea of being zealous, basically being a chud, being fervorous, willing to go far right and claiming your nation back for yourself. The Zealots were known for even attacking other Judeans who were not far right enough. They were absolute mad lads, and they would go and find you and say, your pMFC is not firing enough, so I'm going to make it fire. And they would beat you up, kill you, and attack you. They were often attacking Christians, for example, because Christians were being a little bit soft. They were taking this Timaeus one true God a little bit too serious. They were very concerned about universal morality when we're here to enact hard nationalism. We don't really care about being nice to everyone. We want to be ferocious. Now, everyone should know that the Jews were preparing to throw a revolution against Rome, which would get Judea wiped off the face of the earth for 2,000 years and condemn them to wandering all across the planet until the establishment of modern Israel only 70 years ago. So this is pretty pressing history. A lot of what is happening now was rooted in back then. And it comes from this zealous energy, this fury inside of the Jews, where they're like, we've got the one true religion. We should be the super nationalists. Why are we listening to these Romans following their horrible Roman religion of Jupiter, this pagan religion? Who would follow that? So they're fired up. So Christianity is fundamentally emerging out of this context, and whoa, I'm going to get a lot of trouble for bringing this up. But Christianity is sort of like the woke movement of Judea. You have this zealot energy. You have these Sadducees who are the high priests, the intellectuals probably descended from the people from Alexandria who had constructed this religion. You have the Pharisees who are obsessing about the correct way to do this religion. And all of these together are forming the collective conscience of the Judean people who are gearing up for a fight. And Christ is showing up among this and saying, listen guys, Nah, I don't think we should do this. If we go ahead with this energy, Rome will eat us alive. We're giving in to this impulsive pagan nationalism that's going to get us to take on a beast that is bigger than us, and we will see the same pattern that we've seen throughout our history. We will be driven into exile like what happened in Babylon. The temple will be destroyed, we will lose everything. And on top of this, if you really study our religion, the architecture is not about ferocious nationalism. We're talking about a true universal God, a moral God, the true God. That's what we mean. That's when we read our religion and it says we're chosen to represent the truth. This is what we're talking about, this platonic, glorious God of beauty, truth, and goodness. He's trying to lead people to something assertive and positive. And instead, all these zealots are shutting out all around him. Nietzsche calls Christianity Platonism for the people. Perhaps he didn't even realize how accurate that might be. Because what Jesus does is he goes around to the normal people of Judea and he acts as a mystic reformer, explaining to them that this is the way we should conduct ourselves. We should be reaching up towards the good because there's how we interface with the highest fingerprint of God, which is what progenerates beauty and reality and truth. Don't give in to this chud nationalism. This is precisely why the Jews organized to have Jesus killed. He is a threat to their national energy. He is a demoralizing agent in their eyes. Someone who's trying to get them to think about universal love and higher values instead of the fervorous energy of throwing a revolution. So they organize with the Romans and conspire to get him wiped out. And think about it this way, Jesus is trying to inhibit the impulsive nationalism of the Jews so they open their mind to a higher truth, which is what he thinks is the correct and moral way they should conduct themselves. Don't worry about threats. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to God what is God's. Turn the other cheek. Jesus literally says, you, people of Judea, you've heard to love your neighbors and hate your enemies. But I tell you, instead, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. The nationalist energy within the consciousness of Judea is panicking about this. This is demoralizing. This is taking the wind out of the sails. This is trying to push us into being these moral, priestly, happy-go-lucky, platonic Brahmins instead of a virulent, violent, chud rebel energy. Now, something that will probably get me executed for demoralization is to point out that Christ's presentation, the moral ethos he's promoting, weirdly looks like a woke atheism because he's going against that pagan nationalist instinct, that pMFC that detects threats. He is suppressing it. And what do we remember from the past? What do we remember from the neurophysiology? If you do that, you inhibit these forces. You develop a sort of denationalized God. You become more universal. Maybe it gives you more of an ability to open up your individual conscience. You might even free yourself from cognitive dissonance and take possession of your own soul a little bit more. But you are, in some sense, giving up on your people, giving up on an active God that engages with the world. And this is something also Nietzsche points out. Nietzsche says in The Antichrist, when everything necessary to ascending life, when all that is strong, courageous, masterful, and proud has been eliminated from the concept of a God, when he has sunk step by step to the level of a staff for the weary, a sheet anchor for the drowning, when he becomes the poor man's God, the sinner's God, the invalid's God par excellence, and the attribute of Savior or Redeemer remains as the one essential attribute of divinity, we should ask ourselves, what is the meaning of this metamorphosis? What does such a reduction of the Godhead imply? To be sure, the kingdom of God has thus grown larger. Formerly he had only his own people, his chosen people, but since then he has gone wandering, like his people themselves, into foreign parts. He has given up settling down quietly anywhere. Finally, he has come to feel at home everywhere. This God has become a cosmopolitan, a democrat. Now, this is probably a bit clunky, trying to connect this to atheism in some way, and I don't mean it like that. I mean that modern atheists are, in some sense, true believers in some sort of universal logos and order. They actually believe in this good God, which is why people like Dawkins can maintain a moral idea of universalism and hate the nationalist God Yahweh. And it actually weirdly looks like Christianity in that we're seeing this arrival of a cosmopolitan, universal God God that loses his focus so much on the specific people. And many people would argue this is why Christianity is right and Judaism is wrong. Judaism, like a load of chuds, clutch to nationalism. They hold on to this and try to pin it down and say, no, we want to stay pagan and Yahwehistic. Whereas the religion started to drift off and become more Platonic and universal, became more nice. But this is also weirdly low pMFC. Now, another neuroscientific thing that adds to this story, which I find particularly fascinating. So if you remember that other section of the brain that I was talking about, the dmPFC, which projects this image of God in the sky so you can create a theory of mind about what he would think about you and have him look down on you and judge you and make you feel like crap, make you feel really bad. Well, this part of the brain is very active in the religious in many ways. There's another section of the brain called the vmPFC, which is just underneath this, which is to do with the trolley problem, as I said. This is to do with guilt and anticipating future good emotions, anticipating future bad emotions. This is a separate part of the mind. Now, interestingly, this part of the brain tends to be more active in moral dilemmas in atheists. So there's this split again in the brain related to religiosity and religious positions. Now, what the science seems to suggest is the reason why atheists and believers will deploy these different parts of their brain is based on how they are trying to make moral decisions. If you're trying to make a moral decision about what to do, you might go into your head and use this God in the sky to get a theory of mind about the nationalist collective and what Big G in the sky wants you to do, and use his judgment to stare down on you and decide, am I doing what is right in accordance with the group or in accordance with God or the Godhead or the God figure, the outside force? Atheists don't have that belief structure, so it seems like they don't use this part of their mind for certain moral decisions. Instead, they'll deploy the vmPFC. This is the trolley guy decision thing. And they'll do it in a reference to themselves. Instead of asking what would the pagan oversoul of the collective think, what would the big man in the sky want, it is a question of what is important for me. Will I feel bad about this if I make this moral decision? Now, neither of these decision-making processes are objectively bad, but we see that same problem show up that I spoke about earlier. The dmPFC that connects with the God face in the sky to cast judgment upon yourself is tightly connected to the cognitive dissonance networks. So it's very good at getting you to think, what does the group want me? This is a critical part actually of doing group cognitive dissonance, saying, what would the group want? And then the correct decision is for me to align with the group, maybe at the betrayal of your own conscience. Whereas the vmPFC, the more atheist section perhaps, that is more about personal reference and guilt and forgiveness and reward and these types of things. This is actually a part of your mind that seems to be tied to self-consciousness, self-awareness an awful lot more. For example, when you daydream, when you stand around and you're like, looking around and daydreaming to yourself, if we shut off this vmPFC, if we inhibit it, we will notice that people won't really be able to catch themselves mind wandering. They'll just do it more. Whereas if this is turned on and active, this part is the one that switches on to say, bro, you're standing there like dribbling, staring at the wall, you're thinking, you're fantasizing, become aware of what you're doing and snap out of it, this type of thing. So this vmPFC is a very interesting part of your mind. It seems to be tied to self-awareness, self-conditioning, self-understanding, self-consciousness. But as always, there's paradoxes here, because it seems like atheists, and as you see this in modern liberals, they're very bad at empathizing with the collective. And as I mentioned, people like Jonathan Haidt has seen that their moral valence is more care and personal focused, but they don't seem to be able to understand the value of the collective. They don't seem to understand tradition and authority and the collective identity. And that's something that right-wingers do have a deep understanding of. So liberals and atheists, it seems, are almost subverting that collective enterprise. And they come across as really hostile to the soul, the identity, the high pMFC energy that actually sustains the group. And they are almost traitors to this, obsessed about their individual feelings, their pity they feel towards those who are not getting care, their feelings of personal injustice, their feelings of shame or guilt. It's much more self-obsessed. And is this not what Jesus is doing? He's going around Judea and presenting this beautiful psychological religion, forcing people to disinhibit these unconscious collective urges and asking them to awaken, to go into your individuality and find the kingdom of God within. And look at all these impulses that are clouding your mind and try to disinhibit from them. And in some sense, sort of become atheist, become woke, become separate from these forces so you can have a conscience, so you can have individuality. And of course, this is perceived as this monstrous, dangerous threat, this beast that is coming in and taking out the nationalist movement, that's taking this out. And you still see this today. There's nationalists all across the world who look at Christianity and be like, why are you so cocked? What is going on? Because its implicit point is about disinhibiting those forces and installing inside of people this free conscience. And of course, this explains why Christians who try to bend the religion and make it hard right always have to wrap it up with this convoluted identity. They have to say, oh yeah, we're the real Israelites. We're the black Israelites. We're the white Israelites. We're the Irish Israelites. Whatever it is, we are the true ones and the Jews are the imposters. But the problem is that the point of the religion cannot be this, because it seems like it's an effort to try grasp the truth. And as I've consistently pointed out, if you're going to engage in life, engage in nationalism and race tribalism, you are going to have to invoke unconsciousness, cognitive dissonance, and switch off the truth. These two things are in opposition. The danger, though, is that the truth is a death cult. The truth necessarily makes you hostile to life. It inhibits your ability to collectivize. It turns you into an atheist. As Nietzsche would say, you become a life denier. And this was a problem that was present all over early Christianity. You look at early Christianity and there's this consistent phenomenon of hard Gnostic movements who say the world itself is fake. And the truth is that we need to leave this world altogether. And the entire world is evil and our urges and everything about us are evil. And to the point where the first canon in the Nicene Council, what would you think this is? The Nicene Council where the church comes in and says, right, let's formalize this Christian religion and turn it into Catholicism. You would think the first canon in this meeting that they have is going to be like, right, we're very based, we're the chuds, the Jews suck, you know, white people forever, something like this. Italians forever, no one known them, it'd be like Greeks or Italians forever, those meds. No, that's not what it is. What they're talking about is canon number 1, if someone has castrated themselves, they can't be part of this religion. We need to stop the castrations. Minutes of the meeting number 1. No more castrations. Do you understand how big of a deal this must have been for people to do this? Because Christianity had this death cult element to it. Because it's so forceful on the concept of truth. It's so hostile to life. But there's the paradox. If you want truth, you will have to inhibit the instincts inside of you that blind you, the unconsciousness that wants you to clutch to life. It's a very scary tightrope to walk down, if it's even possible to walk down. Look at someone like Schopenhauer, who literally has this denial of the world religion, Gnosticism in modern philosophy, Christianity, the same thing. If you want a free, conscious soul, you are forced to confront these neural substructures that are stuck in paradox. That's very fascinating. So much of what Christ says follows on these principles. I did not come here to bring peace, but a sword, to divide household, to cut families in half, because I am here to make your conscience free. And this will turn you against your people, your tribe, your mom, your dad, everything. It's going to cause chaos because it's the most extreme position you can take. It's shearing through life to find truth. And he keeps saying, I am the truth and the light. I am showing you this way. This is the force that you're experiencing. And for this, the Jews destroy him. They don't want to get demoralized. And later, they throw their revolution. They have their big fight where they pull at Rome and attack Rome to try claim their freedom. And Rome chimps out in return and eviscerates them, wipes Judea off the map and creates Palestine, sends them out into exile again, but this time it's not for a couple of hundred years like Babylon, it is for thousands of years. They break Judea and eviscerate it. Now, all of a sudden, the Jews are in a horrible position for themselves, where once again they must innovate. They must try to say to themselves, how do we create a nation now that we're stuck in exile as a network state again? And the religion evolves once more. This is where rabbinic Judaism comes in, where they're now trying to interpret, how do we create a Reddit, a 4chan, a Twitter, where we can put all of our thoughts as we live through this struggle to try to figure out what to do. What is the right direction? Are we getting punished by the one true God? What have we done wrong? What is the future? Now, this is going to be the most autistic contribution to the tense relationship between the Jews and the Europeans you've ever heard. But as they exist in European society, they are obviously incentivized to keep the pMFC in the Europeans as low as possible. Because when the Europeans have a strong nationalist religious intensity, they will close out outsiders. They will close out strangers, and they will not like them. So the Jews want to make sure that they hold on to their collective identity, because they need this to survive this huge exilic wandering where they're always getting pushed and assimilated and attacked even. So they're trying to make sure that the people around them liberalize, stay open-minded. And luckily this Christian religion that comes in does give them a very privileged position as the people of the book. When Christianity takes over Rome, in 391 AD, they ban every single pagan religion. They eviscerate them as heresies. And there's only two religions that are permitted by law in Rome. One, Christianity, the state religion, and two, Judaism, because it is the people of the book. It gets a special exemption. This embeds a set of ironies within the psyche of the medieval Europeans that we're still living out today. And these ironies are all based on the pMFC, because Christianity is bringing the Mosaic law that says you must destroy all their graven images and their other idols. There is one true religion, eviscerate everything else. So Christianity operates as a cleansing mechanism, getting rid of paganism out of Europe, the native religions, and bringing their consciousness down into the Middle East. Now, this phenomenon is going into the German tribes, the Celtic tribes, the people in Sweden, and inhibiting their tribalism, turning off their pMFC, getting rid of their old religion, and sucking them into the imperial force of Christianity, which can then utilize all of them to create these giant crusader armies to send down towards Jerusalem or to send up to conquer pagans. So it's a very lofty force, but it is also intimately married to extreme morality, because Christ is so otherworldly. He forces in your face not the virtues of chud, life instinct, mass morality, masculinity. Instead, he is getting you to consider the opposite of all of this, the inversion, the lamb instead of the lion, idealistic morality over impulsive instincts. And Nietzsche would complain that this has evolved us into the modern good Europeans we are today, weighed down by this crazy guilty conscience and trapped, lost, severed from our ancient instincts, which is what we need right now in order to become powerful once again. Now, the Jews' special religious exemption that was granted to them in Rome allows them to avoid the dissolving and destroying forces of Christianity that was waged upon paganism. They are a people who stand alone. They say, listen, we're not Christian, we don't want to participate in this, which the Christians don't take very well. That's basically like saying, yeah, we're not moral, we don't want to participate in your moral world order, we're going to do our own thing, keep our pMFC turned on here in the corner. But at the same time, they are also the people of the book. They're the people that were favored by God and chosen at one point, so the Christians aren't going to eradicate them. So instead, they isolate them, put them in ghettos, use the pMFC to categorize them as the sinful fallen people from before time, before 0 AD when Christ showed up. And so all this tension between the Europeans and Jews comes from this arrangement. The Europeans look and say, why are there outsiders? That is something we will categorize with our pMFC as a threat, as something that we should not trust. The Jews, on the other hand, are trying to hold on to their high pMFC identity. This is how they made a true exile before. They don't want to become assimilated and dissolve and disappear. And this ebb and flow continues until we reach the Enlightenment, where the Europeans liberalize even more. They start to become totally atheistic and open-minded. They start to move into this democratic, meritocratic way of seeing the world. And this is where you see new questions evolve with how to deal with the Jews. Because now the Jews have gone from being second-class citizens to being part of these new European nations. And people like Napoleon say, right, well, we'll get them all to join the army and this will assimilate them. This will dissolve this parochial, backwards, superstitious religious identity they have and allow them to become good Europeans. Nietzsche says the same thing, to have them bred and integrated and assimilated into the European project and have them drop their religious past. But this has its own ironic problems, because even though you shear out these religious identities, the basic tribal identities, the strong pMFC seeing a European race and a Jewish race remains. And this gives rise to Theodor Herzl, who says this is not going to work. The solution to this is Zionism. Theodor Herzl stands up and says, listen, I have a plan. The Europeans are never going to like us. We have opposing pMFCs. We're different races. We're different collectives. We're always going to be at odds. And this is, Herzl says this, you can read his writings. He says, listen, they also kind of have a point. Since we've been wandering, we've been trapped in the ghettos. We've become botched. The diaspora has become dishonorable. We are merchants. We are not proud warrior people. We have lost this. Look at the Old Testament. Look at Yahwehism. We had David. We had these conquests. We had Samson. We were so proud when we had our nation, but we've lost this. So I propose a return to the land, Zionism. And I want all of us in the diaspora who are kind of happy that we're able to sit here and, you can do banking and you can do all these things since we've liberalized during the Enlightenment. I know you have your wealth. I know you're a good merchant. I know you've got money. I know you're doing all well and all that, but you'll never be accepted. You won't be allowed to assimilate. They'll always recognize you as an outsider, and you won't gain your honor back in the eyes of the world. They'll always think of you as somebody who avoided war and avoided the hard path and got interested in finance and things like this. They'll never respect you. You'll never respect yourself. So I want you to come home, return to the land, return back to Zion, turn the pMFC on and establish it, take blood and connect it back to the soil, end the network state. And that's exactly what plays out. Herzl is persuasive. Many Jews decide, you know what, we should become Chuds once again. And this becomes this split in the psyche of Judea as it rolls forward into the 20th century. You see, for example, Winston Churchill talking about the problems of Bolshevism and saying, look, the Jews can go two directions here. They can go and get involved in all these overthrowing communist revolutions and liberalizing revolutions all across the world. And they'll be seen as these like untrustworthy revolutionaries, or they can go with Zionism, is what Churchill says, which will mean that they become a nation and they become honorable, and this is the right path for them to go. And through several deft maneuvers of political opportunism, they managed to get their state in 1948. Herzl's vision comes true. They gain land, they can become farmers, they can become soldiers and gain the virtues that come out of war and tending to a soil. And the psyche within many Zionists is they want to engage in a conquest project, like Joshua, like what they saw in Australia and America when the Europeans took over those large territories. They want to gain their honor by crafting out a state, proving that they're worthy to themselves and perhaps even to the world. But there is a big problem, because not all Jews agree. The diaspora Jews want to inhibit this national instinct in the Jewish people. They think it is the wrong path. They see this as narrow-minded Judaism, and they point out that they hold a very prestigious position in the world. They have a lot of advantages where they are, and pursuing this path of violence and nationalism is actually going to scar their reputation, perhaps forever. Here is Yuval Harari speaking about this, and this is very interesting.
October the 7th, 2023, till now. Where does that fit? Is it footnote or chapter in the sweep of Jewish history?
I think it's could be one of the biggest turning points in Jewish history. Maybe the biggest since the fall of the temple in 70 CE, since the Roman conquest. Because Judaism has survived, it became the world champion in surviving catastrophes, but it never faced a catastrophe like we are dealing with right now, which is a spiritual catastrophe for Judaism itself. Because what is happening right now in Israel could basically, I think, destroy, void 2,000 years of Jewish thinking and culture and existence. That the worst case scenario that we are facing right now, and I emphasize it's a worst case scenario. We can still prevent it, and we can talk later about how to prevent it. But we should be clear about what we are facing if Israel continues on its present trajectory. What we are facing is the potential of an ethnic cleansing campaign in Gaza and the West Bank, resulting in the expulsion of 2 million, maybe more Palestinians from there, the establishment of Greater Israel, the disintegration of Israeli democracy, and the creation of a new Israel, which is based on an ideology of Jewish supremacy and on the worship of what were completely anti-Jewish values for the last 2 millennia. A country based on the worship of power and violence, and which is militarily strong. It will survive, it will be militarily strong, it will have alliances with various bullies around the world. It will also be economically viable, and this will be the spiritual disaster, because this will be the new Judaism that all Jews in the world will have to deal with. It will not disappear. Again, Jews are very good dealing with catastrophes from the Roman conquest to the Holocaust. But this will not be a military catastrophe. The state will actually be successful in military and economic terms. And it will make the challenge much, much bigger. No Jew, say in London or New York or anywhere else, will be able to say, this is not the real Judaism. It's like being, say, a communist in the 1950s in London and saying, no, the Soviet Union is not really communism. They misunderstood it. No, this will be the new Judaism, and maybe the only Judaism.
Now, isn't that interesting? Yerval sounds like Jesus Christ. He is approaching these nationalistic zealots and saying, listen, guys, these chud instincts that we're subjecting ourselves to are becoming too Old Testament, and people will start to see us as just another set of pagans. But what a great advantage we have when we are the moral priests of the world, the universalists, the lofty high priests of all of reality. This gives us much more power than what you are doing. Yerval's saying, become woke. Don't become a nationalist. Don't become a religious zealot. Open your mind. The path of the woke is the path of power. It frees you up to reach up towards higher moral ideals. But it involves you inhibiting your fervorous instincts. What an enormous crisis of conscience. We're going to see this play out in our lifetimes. What an incredible story. We will see how it unfolds. But to end, I would like to focus on the crisis of conscience within us Europeans, because we're going through something similar. And ultimately, I'm not a Jew, and neither are most of you, and our story is coming from a different perspective. But it's intimately intertwined. Our religion comes out of Judea. Our God was the God of the Bible. And since he died, we seem to have sunk into this atheist, liberal, woke energy that seems to be shearing the West apart. We are getting replaced in all of our countries. We are losing ourselves, becoming infertile and sterile. There's something deeply damaged within the soul of the West, and it seems like it's causing it to crumble. And so our impulses are kicking back into gear, because it seems all these, atheist woke people all out there who are representatives who are running this system don't realize that they're in this downwards going death spiral that's going to lead to the disenfranchisement of Europeans all across the world in every single homeland that we have. And this is very crazy to us. And the instincts kick on inside of the youth because they want life. You're seeing now across the board in the youth in many different countries, from Germany to America to Australia, everywhere, there is this huge surge in nationalism. People are looking at right-wing parties, but generally even beyond just simple politics, they are embracing a culture that is identitarian, nationalistic. It is about pride in one's identity and who they are, as opposed to the guilt that was present for the last couple of years in the woke era. And on top of this is going along with a religious revival that is markedly the first time we've seen a break in the atheist trend. Atheism won, it defeated, it was champion in 2015, and now there seems to be an impulse in the opposite direction. Along with this identitarian impulses, we're seeing the atheist impulses get killed and religiosity rise. I'm claiming perhaps this is the neuroscientific concept. I'm obviously conflating an awful lot with these little neurobiological things, but is it the pMFC kicking into gear again? People notice threats. Oh my God, I'm in danger. There's something wrong with my life. I'm not going to have a future. All the economies are going to collapse. I'm going to get stabbed in the cities. So their brains turn on and they grip back to identitarian religiousness. They go back to God. They go back to a nationalist way of understanding religion, God and country. It all kicks into gear. So this is this impulse that is rising. But we have so many crises of conscience that we need to shear through because there's all sorts of ironies and issues. Take, for example, Jordan Peterson, one of the premier archetypes of the rise of the Western man to stand against this woke tide, this atheist mob that was dragging us into communism. He stands up and he wants to resist this. But even within him, this enormous crisis of conscience is still present. So he's saying, I want to bring back religiosity, but he pulls the brakes on nationalism. He pulls the brakes on letting the pMFC really switch on. He's like, whoa, boys, we Europeans can't do that because that turns into a Nazism. You'll do a Hitler if you do this. We're not allowed to do this. We must inhibit here. European identity and pride, that's pure evil. That's privilege. That's something that I will not allow. Because European civilization, and this is what he says on video, comes from the Middle East. It's not even European. You're not even real. You don't create anything. Everything you want comes from this story of the Bible because this is the truth. And you were barbarians who were civilized. And what you're trying to do with your nationalism is go back to your barbarism. And I want you to just go back to Christianity in and of itself. And this is this very stark irony. There's something wrong with Jordan's perception. And you know this because it got exposed in the last 3 years because he sublimates that nationalism into the identitarian project of the Bible. It's a psychological problem where he can't allow himself to feel pride for his own people. So he projects it into the Judeans, into the Israelites. Even though the Jews have huge factions that criticize Israel in all sorts of ways, Jordan will say, well, I know what the Jews are. They are these Zionist Israelites. This is what they are. And their nationalism is good in and of itself because they're the chosen people of the Bible and they've been oppressed their whole lives, and this is a moral thing that I can participate in to allow them to get what they want. And you know what, Netanyahu? Give them hell. Bomb the crap out of them. And this is incredible. It's almost pathological because his instincts are all misfiring. They're attached to the wrong things. They're confused. He sublimates his own ethnic pride, and it comes out in almost like this fervorous desire for the chosen people to live through Joshua again. Now, what are we going through right now? We're going through a scientific revolution that's happening to this day. We've only got the genomic revolution in the last 15 years that is completely reevaluating our entire concept of prehistory, and it's shearing through an awful lot of the Bible. And we see someone like Jordan Peterson, how pathologized he's become by attaching himself to this story of history, to the point where his instincts misfire, and even his project of finding some sort of grand truth is distorted and clouded by this.
Did the Exodus story happen? Did the Jews enslaved in Egypt break free of their slavery and move to the Promised Land across the desert for 40 years? Did that happen? You have also said, of the Exodus specifically, it's still happening.
Yes.
Now, to me, that's far more inappropriate than saying that the Spirit is still moving across the face of the waters, because I think what people mean there is, do you believe that these people in that time period actually did this in such a way that, for instance, might show up in an archaeological report?
Well, I think that's the simplest answer to that is probably.
Sure, and that's
Right.
fine too. But then,
But we don't know.
But then-
I mean, there is, like, to the degree that there's been archaeological investigations into the kinds of biblical narratives that you've described, the archaeological evidence tends to fall on the side of historical accuracy in relationship to the Bible, quite surprisingly often.
And this is almost tragic because Jordan is living through this woke, chaotic time where the breakdown of Western civilization is happening. And he's trying to grab onto something that's ordered and secure so he can stabilize his own soul and help stabilize the soul of his people. I believe his intentions are somewhat good. And this is something Carl Jung always mentioned. Be very careful denying Christ, thinking you can become a Nietzschean, you can become free from all this nonsense, you can become a new atheist or something like this, because religion is much more than a set of ideas. It's much, much more than that. You can become a Nietzschean, and where are you going to find your wife? What church or community are you going to integrate into where there'll be girls and there'll be people who, can help you through your life? How are you going to find these things? How are you going to find something that's going to explain to you death? What are you going to be like, oh, Nietzsche, I'm dying, please. I want to pray to you to pass my soul into the afterlife. How is any of that going to work? You become incredibly destabilized when you cast off things that religion offers. And what religion offers is often very substructural. It is things like ritual, community, integration, marriage. How is Nietzscheanism going to give your parents a funeral? What are you going to do? You're going to hold up Beyond Good and Evil and burn them in a pyre like an ancient Greek or something like that? How's that going to work? What are you going to do? So there's this destabilization when you're trying to break away and do something new. And it's always advisable to realize that the firm footing of your tradition is valuable. And this is why our instincts, especially as these energies rise inside of us, default back to this. They go back into our ancestral religion of Christianity because this helps stabilize it, and it does have these rituals of life in place. But this is this really serious problem. The death of God problem is so serious because it is wrought up with the idea of it being true. We tell ourselves it's true. Jordan has to believe it's true. So his psychology grasps onto this religion and wants it to be true. It must be true. It has to be true because it's the truth. It's the religion. And he also has to then graft his nationalism into it. Well, if it's true and it's true history and it's reality and it's God's word, the chosen people must also be the nationalist people who I feel my energies for. He's attaching his soul to this story. But we're going through the shearing power of the scientific enlightenment still. And the amazing power of genomics and matter and finding hidden stories in stones and artifacts and flesh is ripping apart even the Bible itself at this point. It's tearing this story out of Jordan's hands, and Jordan sounds incoherent because he's trying to hold on to it. He wants it to be archaeologically true. It has to be. He's in serious trouble if it's not, because he'll have an identity crisis. His mind will crumble. What would you do at this point? Think how much he's invested in promoting this, calling Europeans sinful if they engage in their pride. He's completely dismissed European heritage. Have you ever heard Jordan Peterson talk about Indo-Europeans or Irish paganism or things like this? He doesn't go into these topics because they're almost blocked out of his mind as not relevant, as worthy of being dismissed, as having no weight. The Bible, the Old Testament, is presented to us as deeper and older. This is how it was always claimed to be. It's this ancient religion that stretches back into prehistory. But even a rudimentary engagement with the scholarship shows you that's not true. And again, modern revolutions that are only happening right now, like genomics, are exposing this as crazier than you can even imagine. Take, for example, the Christian identity or British Israelite theory, which claims that when Assyria came in and deported all the Israelites, they went up into North Assyria, and then when Babylon rose up, they fled up through the Caucasus and went into Ukraine and then spread up, and they became the Danes, the Germans, the Saxons, the Swedes, essentially the Goths, and then they moved into that territory, and then they moved out and conquered the world. The chosen people are us, Germanics, Northwestern Europeans, and we are the true Israelites, and we're the lost tribes. This is obviously people trying to clutch onto a positive identity, and they take their religion and they bend what they can find in the history to suit them, and they read all these historical sources and find a very elaborate way of justifying it all. It's like, we was kangs. It's basically that instinct. Now, the problem here, of course, is genomics. The genetic revolution has actually studied all of this stuff and discovered that the Germanics did not come from Assyria, even though that sounds very far back in the distance, 1,700 years before Christ, 2,700 years ago. Wow, that's like 3,000 years ago. That's really old. We've done the genomic studies. We've looked at our DNA, and it turns out that the Europeans, the Germanics, the Saxons, the Irish, the French, all of us tribes of Israel, we have been in Europe for 2,000 years before the Assyrian deportations. In fact, our history is so old that allegedly when Moses happened in Exodus, we were already in Europe for 1,500 years. We are extremely ancient, and our traditional pagan religions, which were always treated as redundant, as lies that needed to be taken by Christian monks and bent and connected back to Noah and genealogies of the Bible, it turns out that those pagan myths might have been more accurate and more historical than the Bible. Take, for example, the Irish. We're all staunch Catholics. Irish nationalists are often heavy Catholics. But if you look at our Irish myths, they tell us the story of this successive wave of these strange people coming in, these people groups arriving into Ireland successively. Now, we run the gene studies and we discovered that there was an Indo-European conquest that shows up in the genetics, and 90% of modern Irish people come from this wave of Indo-Europeans that came in, the Bell Beakers. This happened thousands of years before anything in the biblical story. And when you look into Irish myth, it is a story of these Fomorian, Neolithic farmer-type characters getting conquered by this arrival of these Tuatha Dana, these conquering Indo-European people. We discover this in the genes. We found people in the ground that confirmed that this was a historical memory. Now think about the irony here. You have Jordan Peterson, who's basing his career now on saying stuff like, look, the Exodus contains, a fiction truth, an abstract truth. It's like Hamlet. It's like fiction truth, which is, I kind of agree with that on some point. But you can see how he's garbling and he's trying to grasp onto it. And he's like, oh, do I believe in God? What do I believe about all this? He's really struggling with this concept of truth. He wants to find this truth in the Bible. Well, the Exodus, the archaeology looks all right, and I guess you could say it kind of did happen. And here you have Alex O'Connor being like, no, did it happen or not? Yes or no? Now, if he believed in the European people and he looked into these genomic studies because he loves myths. He wanted to discover if myths are true. Is there truth to myths? He would go into the Irish myths and he would go into the various pagan myths and he'd look into them and be like, oh God, yeah, they're true. Yeah, they are historical. They have value. The genes have confirmed that the story in the Irish myths was real. It was a historical event that was mythologized. It's completely real. It's grounded. Like, we have it. It's not controversial. Isn't that crazy? The truth is actually on his side, but he is looking in the wrong place. In fact, he's pathologized the one place that would reveal to him what he's looking for. He would find these profound, grounded myths and truths. Instead, he's trying to grab onto this other tradition that has weak archaeological foundations, that is struggling at its roots, that we're penetrating in with our spectacles and finding that, wow, this thing might not be near as deep as people promised. And back home, the place that we want to say is all barbarians and irrelevant and prideful Nazis and evil and bad, back home there is a deeper, older and more solid truth. It is realer than you could ever possibly imagine. It's just that we didn't write stuff down. We're too much chuds, admittedly. We're chuds. We're not very good at the old writing thing. It took us a while to kick into gear, so no one remembered. So no one could treat that as truth. But now, with genes, with matter, we have gained this insight. And this allows me to reach our conclusion, because this circles back fundamentally to a question of respect, self-respect. I read through the Jewish story, I read through the story of the Israelite tribes, I read through this tradition, and it actually gives me this huge respect. I really appreciate this perspective. I love it. I think it's so rich. There's so much in the Bible, even though the archaeology might be a little bit, there is still an amazing story of a people, an amazing way you can watch these people move and weave throughout history and struggle with religious concepts. And even the archaeological conspiracies are fascinating even in and of themselves. It's an incredible thing to study, and it's not going away anytime soon. This is going to remain one of the most valuable case studies of a people in all of human history. It is an incredible asset for our understanding of ourselves. But it is based fundamentally on a people who is not us, who respect themselves and are doing a natural thing, a high pMFC thing where they're saying, listen, we're the chosen people. Our story makes us the main characters of the story. This is how it works. And this is so persuasive that when it comes into Europe, it like obliterates our minds. And we say, well, we want to be the chosen people. We have to be the Israelites. We try to rob it off the Jews. Be like, no, we're the real ones. Or like Jordan Peterson, we try project it on the Jews and deny ourselves. And Nietzsche has an amazing quote in Genealogy of Morals that sort of deals with this. He talks about the essence of master morality, how masters value themselves. Nietzsche points out that masters, the ancient Greeks specifically, this is Nietzsche, they name themselves, for instance, the truthful. This is first done by the Greek nobility whose mouthpiece is found in Theogonies. The word ethlos, which is coined for the purpose, signifies etymologically one who is, one who has reality, who is real, who is true. And then with a subjective twist, the true and the truthful. At this stage in the evolution of the idea, it becomes the motto and party cry of the nobility and completes the transition to the meaning noble, so as to place outside the pale the lying, vulgar man who deceives and deceives himself. So what is Nietzsche saying here? He's pointing out this is the Greeks' version of we're the chosen people, chosen by God. This is a natural wellspring of self-confidence that comes out of the Greek nobility. And it is about saying you're the real gangsters, you're the real ones, you're the main characters, the ones with aura at the center of the story. This is the psychological expression of one of the healthiest people in all of human history, the ancient Greeks. They are pedestalizing their presence, their reality. And there's value in that because you see in Jordan Peterson a negation of himself. He is not a real one. Europeans cannot be real ones. Instead, that is the privilege of the chosen. You see this in the Jews. They choose themselves to be real, and look at what they've achieved. Their religion is everywhere in the world. Their story is so central to so many people's hearts because they embrace this psychological potency. And of course, you'll notice the nihilism of the woke that has been so pernicious to the European identity, which so many people are reacting to, is predicated on this inhibition, this denial of your reality, saying that you must be guilty, you cannot be real. The Europeans are the source of all evil in the world. You must be shackled with self-hate. You cannot have reality, you cannot have presence. This is seemingly the crux of everything. It's a very fascinating thing to meditate on. And so I will leave you with that. Do you think that this will be the phenomenon that resolves our crisis of conscience? Is this the end point of the death of God? We process all this madness, we purge ourselves of all these delusions, and our science shears through all of reality, then we're forced to find the deepest questions. And maybe we have to look in ourselves to find that. Who knows? I'll leave it up to you. Maybe there is value in deep inhibition and going against ourselves so that we can open up our pMFC and explore more truth. Who knows? Maybe we need a touch of woke nihilism or Christianity. There's an interesting question. But this is all a question for the future. I think we are going to live through these giant titanic forces as they clash and shear our souls apart, and they will resolve themselves in the most fascinating ways. Thank you very much for listening. It's time to shill my book again in case you missed the last shilling advertisement. So the reason why I was able to penetrate so deeply into this question is because I'm writing a book, and this forms the backbone of one of the chapters. Something that has been interesting me for a while is the identity crisis in the West, how you see the political upheaval taking place, how it's so related to religiousness, and all these ironies and problems that come out of this. So diving deep into our traditional religion was something that I have wanted to do properly for a while, to go in all the research, and this has allowed me to do this. So the book will explore this. Go beyond that as well and ask other interesting questions. So if you're interested in seeing what that's like, you can go on the waitlist now. It is still currently in writing, and I will release it to you. I will send you the audiobook for free. I will give you a 50% discount on the physical book, and you can pay for whatever you want to get onto the waitlist. You can pay $1 or $1 bazillion or $50 or whatever it is. You can do what you wish. So there will be a link to that down below. Thank you very much for your time, and let us end with a song I made on the biblical story of the Garden of Eden.
Well, she stole an apple from the tree, and the snake rolled down and took her soul. And she told me how much she could see, and she said, please don't leave me alone. Well, she stole an apple from the tree, and the snake rolled down and took her soul. And she told me how much she could see, and she said, please don't leave me alone. Now my eyes are open, and I see it all. Well, the day has come, but I still feel alone. So I took a bite. Oh, now I know we're in paradise when we are. And the snake rolled down and took her soul. And she told me how much she could see, and she said, please don't leave me alone. Well, I got it from the tree of life, and down an angel came with fury in his eyes. Leave our land of peace where nothing dies, and find your own way back to our paradise, yeah. I think I found myself again. Sha-na-na-na-na-na-na. I think I found myself again. Whoa, hey, hey. I think I found myself again. Sha-na-na-na-na-na. Hey. I think I found myself again. Oh, so we stole an apple and grappled with the fact that we're falling and wondering what's happened. Eve, she said, oh, Adam, how I love you, but I'm losing my fucking mind. Could that be more than paradise? Could our love be eternal life? We seek, but we never quite seem to find. One bite, babe, and we leave it all behind. Oh no, God said knowledge is a crime. Oh, Adam, Eden's on the line. Oh no, evil's on the vine. Oh, I can hear him calling out a lie. Oh no, he's screaming in my mind. Now I see the garden, lost the time. But babe, this is on my mind. Would you say it's my fault? While she stole an apple from the tree, and the snake rolled down and took her soul. And she told me how much she could see, and she said, please don't leave me alone. Well, she stole an apple from the tree, and the snake rolled down and took her soul. And she told me how much she could see, and she said to me, baby, listen now.